Tonight, you are invited to drift through the ancient history of the Druids, guardians of sacred groves, keepers of hidden wisdom, and guides between the seen and unseen. Their stories unfold not in haste, but like leaves falling one by one, each carrying memory, each carrying silence. As you listen, you'll find yourself among oak and mistletoe, rivers and stones where rituals were whispered in moonlight and truths were carved in silence. You do not need to hold on to every detail. Let them pass by like clouds over water, steady and calm. This is a journey not only into history but into stillness and into the mystery of what has always been waiting in the sacred groves. Chapter 1. The first echoes of the Druids. Long before their names were inscribed in chronicles, and long before their image was reimagined in poetry, the Druids lived only in memory. They were part of a world that moved without writing, where stories travelled in the voice, in song, and in ritual. The Celts, scattered through what is now Ireland, Britain, France, and across the rivers of Central Europe, placed these figures at the centre of their societies. The Druids were not kings, but they stood beside kings. They were not warriors, but their counsel shaped war and peace. In the fragile balance of tribal life, they held authority that was both spiritual and judicial. They were the keepers of what could not be carved in stone: law, custom, myth, and meaning. To speak of them is to trace the breath of a world that left no texts, no manifestos, no sacred scriptures, only fragments carried forward by the words of outsiders. The first such outsider glimpses come from the Greeks. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, a philosopher named Sotion wrote of wise men among the Celts, calling them Druidae. His words survive only in fragments, preserved by later compilers. He described them as philosophers of nature, much like the sages of the East, who spoke of the soul's immortality. Already the Druids stood not as curiosities, but as thinkers comparable to those who contemplated the stars in Athens or the mysteries in Delphi. Later, other Greek authors echoed these impressions. Strabo, writing around the time of Augustus, divided the learned men of the Celts into 3 groups: the bards, who composed verse, the vats, who performed sacrifices and studied natural philosophy, and the druids, who explored moral philosophy and the laws of society. Though these categories may have been simplifications, they suggest that the Druids were seen as the highest among them, not mere priests, but guides of the unseen order. The Romans, whose armies pressed steadily into Celtic lands, left the most detailed records. Julius Caesar, in his commentaries on the Gallic War, offered an account of the Druids that still shapes how they are imagined. He described them as presiding over public and private sacrifices, teaching youth in secluded places, and carrying the burden of oral instruction so vast that some students trained for 20 years. He wrote that they believed the soul did not perish, but passed after death into another body, a conviction that, he observed, inspired bravery among warriors who no longer feared death as an end. Caesar's words, though written in the language of conquest, carry a trace of admiration. He saw in the Druids both order and depth, an intellectual class unlike any other among the tribes of Gaul. Yet his account is not free of distortion. He may have amplified their cohesion, emphasizing hierarchy where there was diversity, in order to cast them as a force to be dismantled for Rome's victory. Still, his testimony lingers as one of the clearest windows into their presence. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, focused more on ritual. He recorded the ceremony of gathering mistletoe performed with great solemnity. According to him, Druids climbed into oak trees, cut the sacred plant with a golden sickle, and sacrificed animals beneath its branches. He observed their reverence for natural elements, trees, groves, and the cycles of the heavens, painting them as priests of nature's power. Though his tone was at times skeptical, he preserved details that echo in the imagination even now. These fragments, from Sotion, Strabo, Caesar, and Pliny, are scattered, partial, and filtered through foreign eyes. None were written by the Druids themselves. Oral tradition left no carved letters to decipher, no canon of scripture to preserve their teachings. Their wisdom lived only in memory, in verse recited beside fires, in judgments spoken beneath trees, in rituals carried out in the hush of the forest. What was not remembered by voice was lost to silence. To think of the Druids at this earliest stage is to imagine a people defined not by monuments, but by presence. Their groves were their temples, their knowledge was their scripture. Their voices carried the law from one generation to the next. Without ink or parchment, they entrusted all to human memory, fragile, enduring, alive. In these earliest echoes, one also finds the shadows of their power. Roman accounts suggest that Druids judged disputes, determined punishments, and decided who could participate in sacred rites. Those who were banished from their presence were treated as outcasts, denied even the comfort of community. Their authority stretched from the spiritual to the social, binding people in law as well as in ritual. The Celts who revered them did not leave portraits or statues. The Druids remained faceless, their presence sensed only through what others observed. Were they robed in white, as later poets imagined? Or were they dressed as any other, their difference marked only by their role? The silence of archaeology leaves such questions open, inviting not answers, but reflection. The echoes that survive are not uniform. Some Roman authors portrayed them as noble sages, deeply learned in philosophy. Others painted them in darker shades, accusing them of human sacrifice, of practices both feared and condemned. The truth may lie between, in rituals both solemn and severe, in traditions both healing and harsh. Yet because the Druids themselves left no testimony, what survives is a mirror of what outsiders chose to see. In this uncertainty lies their enduring mystery. They are remembered not through the clarity of fact, but through the haze of interpretation. Each fragment is like a voice carried faintly on the wind, clear enough to suggest meaning, faint enough to leave silence around it. Imagine, for a moment, the Celts who gathered beneath oak trees 2,000 years ago. Imagine the hush as the Druid raised a hand to speak, the circle of listeners waiting for words that would decide disputes, declare seasons, or explain the fate of the soul. These were moments that shaped communities, yet passed into air the moment they were spoken. What survives now is not their sound, but the memory that they once existed. The first echoes of the Druids are thus not only historical fragments, they are also reminders of what cannot be fully recovered. Their presence lives in the margins of Roman chronicles, in the notes of Greek philosophers, and in the imagination of those who seek to understand. But it also lives in absence, in the recognition that some wisdom does not survive in text, but drifts quietly in time. As this chapter closes, the Druids remain undefined. They are glimpsed, not grasped. Their earliest echoes remind us that history is not always a record, but often a silence, and that within that silence, meaning still stirs. Chapter 2: Gaul and the Druidic Homeland. In the ancient world, long before the borders of France or Belgium or Switzerland took shape, there was Gaul. It was not a single nation, but a wide land woven from tribes, rivers, forests, and open fields. Across this land, the Druids stood not as strangers or outsiders, but as the heart of its rhythm. To speak of Gaul is to step closer to the landscape where the Druids lived most vividly, and where foreign writers first tried to capture their presence in words. Gaul stretched across much of Western Europe. The people who lived there shared cultural roots with other Celts, yet their identity was not uniform. Each tribe carried its own leaders, its own customs, and its own loyalties. What bound them together was not a centralized state, but shared language, shared art, and a sense of kinship. Within that fabric, the Druids were more than priests. They were the thread that held the weave together, carrying lore, memory, and sacred meaning across tribal lines. It is from Julius Caesar, the general who sought to conquer these lands in the 1st century before the Common Era, that the most detailed account of the Druids in Gaul survives. Caesar described them in his commentaries on the Gallic War, noting their influence on both religious and civic life. He wrote that they presided over sacrifices, guided education, and served as judges in disputes. According to him, their authority extended even beyond Gaul, for Druids from distant regions would gather together once each year in a sacred place of central Gaul to settle questions and pass judgments. This council, if Caesar's words hold truth, shows how the Druids transcended tribal divisions. In a land often marked by conflict between chieftains, they represented continuity and order. Their rulings could bind tribes together. Their teachings could carry wisdom across generations. Caesar remarked that those who refused their judgments were cast out, treated as impure, as if stripped of protection by both men and gods. Such exclusion reveals how deeply their authority touched daily life. To be cut off from the Druids was to be cut off from belonging itself. Caesar also noted their devotion to learning. He described how Druidic students were trained for long years, memorizing verses instead of writing them down. To modern readers, this may seem a limitation. Yet within oral tradition, the refusal to write preserved both secrecy and vitality. Words lived only in the breath of memory. A verse was not a mark on parchment, but a rhythm that could move with the seasons, adapting as needed, always alive. In Gaul, this oral culture allowed the Druids to shape minds with knowledge that was both fluid and enduring. Beyond Caesar, other Roman observers added details, though always through their own perspective. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, turned his attention to ritual. His famous description of the mistletoe ceremony has captured imaginations for centuries. Druids climbing oak trees, cutting the plant with a golden sickle, catching it in a white cloth, and offering sacrifices below. Pliny interpreted these acts as signs of deep reverence for nature, though his tone was also marked by curiosity and unease. For the Roman mind, accustomed to temples of stone and marble, a grove of trees serving as a temple was both strange and compelling. To the Celts of Gaul, however, the forest was a sanctuary. The oak was not just a tree, but a presence. The grove was not only a place of gathering, but a sacred boundary where human law met divine order. The Druids were the interpreters of that order. They saw patterns in stars and seasons, in rivers and plants, in the very cycles of life and death. The landscape of Gaul was not just geography to them, it was a living text, read and remembered without ink. Caesar also wrote that the Druids taught about the soul's immortality. According to his account, they believed the soul passed from one body into another after death. This teaching, he said, inspired courage in battle, for it removed fear of the grave. For the Romans, such belief invited comparison to philosophies they already knew, like the teachings of Pythagoras or Plato. Whether Caesar emphasized this similarity to make the Druids more comprehensible to his readers, or whether it reflected the truth of their teaching, remains uncertain. Yet the idea itself, that death is not an ending but a transformation, reveals the spiritual depth the Druids carried into the daily lives of the Gauls. The Druids of Gaul were also said to be astronomers and healers. They studied the movement of stars, the turning of the seasons, and the properties of plants. Pliny noted that their knowledge of herbs and remedies was both practical and infused with ritual. Healing in their hands was not separated from worship. To cure illness was to restore balance, to realign body and spirit with the harmony of nature. Yet these glimpses are always partial. The Romans looked upon the Druids with a mix of respect and fear. They admired their learning, yet condemned certain practices, especially sacrifice. Some Roman accounts accused the Druids of offering human lives to the gods, enclosed in great wicker figures or laid upon sacred altars. Archaeological finds in Gaul, bodies buried in bogs, bones marked with ritual cuts, suggest that sacrifice may indeed have taken place, though not always as the Romans imagined. What to Roman eyes was cruelty may to the Gauls have been a solemn act of offering, an attempt to communicate with forces greater than themselves. Through these accounts, one begins to sense the duality of the Druids' place in Gaul. They were revered by their own people, yet feared by outsiders. They stood for continuity, yet they were also accused of practices that invited condemnation. They preserved memory, yet they left no written trace of themselves. Their presence was both strong and elusive. When Caesar pressed his conquest across Gaul, he sought not only to defeat warriors, but to dismantle the order that held society together. The Druids, as guardians of law and ritual, stood in the way of Roman assimilation. To conquer Gaul fully, Rome had to weaken their influence. By the 1st century of the empire, official suppression of the Druids was underway, with laws banning their rights. Yet memory is not so easily erased. Even as their public role diminished, their image continued to echo, reshaped by the very voices that tried to silence them. To walk through the idea of Gaul as the Druidic homeland is to walk a line between presence and absence. The land itself held their temples in its forests, their knowledge in its stars, their medicine in its plants. Their voices carried through councils and judgments, shaping how tribes lived and how they understood death. But the testimony we hold comes through foreign eyes, written not to preserve, but to control. The Druids of Gaul emerge both as real figures grounded in history and as shadows, half formed by the pens of conquerors. And yet, even in this distance, one can imagine their place in daily life. A dispute between clans settled beneath the trees. A young student reciting verses in the dim light of morning. A healer walking along the edge of a river, gathering herbs for a remedy. A priest raising his arms beneath an oak, speaking words now lost to silence. These are the fragments that remain, glimpses of the Druids as they once lived in Gaul, when their presence was the living heart of Celtic order. The chapter fades, leaving the thought that in Gaul, the Druids were both everywhere and nowhere, everywhere in influence, nowhere in writing. What they carried survives not in their own voice, but in echoes refracted through others. And in those echoes, the sacred rhythm of their homeland still lingers, like a quiet pulse beneath the soil. Chapter 3. Sacred Groves of the Isles. Across the lands of the British Isles, there are places where silence lingers longer than it should, where the wind bends with a different weight, and where trees seem older than their years. These are the groves once held sacred by the Druids, temples without walls, sanctuaries where the human world and the spirit world drew close. To walk into such a space is to step into a chamber not built by stone or hand, but by the patient growth of nature itself. The oak stood at the heart of many such groves. Its broad trunk, its towering canopy, and its deep root spoke of endurance and wisdom. For the Druids, the oak was more than a tree. It was a pillar that bridged earth and sky. Underneath its shade, rituals were performed, councils were held, and wisdom was passed from teacher to disciple. The grove was not only a setting for worship, but also a living presence that shaped the rhythm of the rites themselves. Roman writers, like Pliny the Elder, hint at this devotion. He describes Druids climbing into oak branches to cut mistletoe, with a golden sickle accompanied by prayers and sacrifice. Though the details are filtered through foreign eyes, the essence remains. The grove was alive, and within it, every plant, stone, and breath carried meaning. To the Druid, mistletoe was no ordinary growth. It was a gift from the heavens, gathered in places chosen not by human design, but by nature's own hand. You can picture the hush that settled when such ceremonies began, the leaves overhead muffled, the sound of the world beyond. The air beneath the canopy thickened, as though the trees themselves leaned in to listen. Within that hush, words of blessing were spoken, and gestures repeated, passed down through generations who believed that balance with the unseen must be tended carefully like a flame in the night. Sacred groves were also schools. Here, disciples sat in circles, learning long verses by heart, absorbing laws, stories, and cosmologies. The Druids did not write these things down. Knowledge was carried in memory, woven into the voice, shaped in repetition until it became inseparable from the speaker. For 20 years or more, a disciple might train beneath the oaks, gathering teachings not as ink on a page, but as living sound. The grove gave shelter for this transmission. Surrounded by the steady presence of trees, students could feel the weight of tradition anchoring them. They learned not only of gods and rituals, but also of law, medicine, and the cycles of time. The setting itself taught patience, for nature moves slowly, and wisdom matures only with time. Across the Isles, certain groves were set apart as places where no weapon could be raised, where no blood could be spilled. They became sanctuaries in both a spiritual and a social sense. Disputes might be resolved here, oaths sworn, and treaties sealed. A grove could protect the fugitive and shelter the vulnerable. In such places, human life mirrored the calm of the natural order, if only for a moment. Fragments of this reverence still echo in place, names scattered through Britain and Ireland. Words tied to oaks, to sacred enclosures, to gatherings of trees, carry traces of what once was. Archaeology uncovers earthworks near ancient woodland, hinting at spaces where ritual might have blended with the natural growth. Yet much of the grove's essence remains hidden, lost not to neglect, but to the silence demanded by the Druids themselves. Roman expansion in these lands met resistance not only on the battlefield, but also in the grove. Accounts speak of sacred woods being cut down, burned, or desecrated to break the spiritual spine of the people. Tacitus describes the Roman assault on the island of Mona, where Druids and their followers stood among groves, chanting curses, raising their hands in defiance. Before soldiers pressed forward with sword and flame, the destruction of those sanctuaries was more than military. It was the attempt to sever a culture from its spiritual ground. Even so, memory endures. In later folklore, groves remain charged with mystery. They become places where fairies are, said to dwell where voices whisper in the leaves, where one should not linger too long after dusk. Though Christian churches rose across the aisles, stories carried forward the old sense that trees still hold secrets, that certain spaces in the natural world are marked as different. You begin to sense why groves mattered. They offered a meeting, point where the seen and the unseen could draw near, not through carved idols or enclosed shrines, but through what already stood, living, rooted, breathing. A grove did not separate a worshipper from nature, it immersed them in it. To stand beneath branches that had weathered centuries was to be reminded of scale, of endurance, of the delicate thread connecting all beings. Imagine entering such a grove at dawn. Mist curls low between trunks. Light filters gently, scattering across leaves. Birds stir, their song carrying softly. Beneath the canopy, there is space to breathe, to listen, to sense that time itself slows. It is not only a scene of beauty, it is a lesson without words. The grove shows that life is interwoven, that stillness has its own depth, and that some truths require silence more than speech. For the Druids, the grove was both altar and teacher. Its walls were bark and branch, its ceiling an open sky, its foundation the patient earth. To those who entered with reverence, it revealed that the divine does not dwell far away, but rises quietly through the roots beneath one's feet and the breath moving through one's chest. Perhaps this is why the memory of the sacred grove persists even when the details of the rituals fade. People still walk into woods seeking calm, renewal, or clarity. They may not call it a temple, yet the effect is the same, a softening of the heart, a widening of thought, a recognition that something greater is present in the quiet. And so, across the British Isles, long after the Druids themselves are gone, the groves remain, silent, steady, and watchful, holding secrets in their shade, waiting for those who still know how to pause and listen and feel the hush beneath the trees. Chapter 4. The oak and the mistletoe. Across the ancient landscapes of the Isles, few symbols hold the same weight as the oak and the mistletoe. Their presence, intertwined in myth and in practice, guided rituals, marked seasons, and framed the ways in which people understood the divine order of the world. Together, they were not mere plants, but sacred witnesses to the mysteries of life, death, and the eternal sky. The oak, with its towering form, stood as the most honored of trees. Its roots reached deep into the soil, while its crown touched the heavens, a living bridge between earth and sky. In its strength, people saw permanence, endurance, and a channel for divine presence. Many communities believed that spirits dwelled within its bark, and that the groves where it grew were not chosen by chance, but by destiny. To stand beneath its canopy was to enter a space where the ordinary world softened and the unseen became near. Mistletoe, by contrast, was subtle, hidden, and rare. It did not grow from the ground, but appeared high among the branches, as though it had descended from another realm. Its roots did not sink into soil, but clung to the host, suspended in a place between earth and air. This strangeness gave it a sense of wonder. The Druids, keepers of sacred knowledge, regarded it as a gift sent from the heavens, a living fragment of the divine essence woven into the body of the oak. When mistletoe was found upon an oak, it was treated as an omen of extraordinary significance. Rituals surrounded its harvest, always performed with solemnity and reverence. Ancient accounts describe how Druids would ascend with care, carrying golden sickles, never of iron, to cut the plant free. The golden blade symbolized purity, untouched by the corruption of common metals. Beneath the tree, a white cloth was stretched to receive the plant so it would never fall upon the earth. For the earth was already bound by mortality, and mistletoe was seen as too sacred to be touched by decay. The ceremonies that followed were believed to bring blessings. People spoke of healing, fertility, and the turning of fate. The mistletoe's berries, translucent and pale, resembled drops of light or seeds of life, and so they were thought to carry within them the spark of creation itself. Livestock were given portions of it during certain rites to ensure abundance. Families would keep fragments within their homes to guard against sickness or misfortune. In these small gestures, everyday life met the eternal, and people felt their existence tied to rhythms larger than themselves. The oak, on its own, was also bound to the cycles of the heavens. Many ancient sites in the Isles align with the sun's rising or setting upon solstices, and the oak often stood as a marker of those alignments. Its strength was not only physical but cosmic, a reflection of the order that bound the seasons. To the Druids, who observed the movement of stars and measured the shadows of stones, the oak embodied continuity. It reminded people that even as days shortened or lengthened, even as generations passed, the world held to its patterns. Together, oak and mistletoe shaped ceremonies that touched the heart of communal life. Festivals timed with the solstices, or equinoxes often involved their symbols. In winter, when daylight was at its thinnest, and hope leaned toward the fragile, mistletoe became a sign of life that persisted. Its green remained vibrant, even when the forests stood bare. In summer, when the oak spread its full canopy, it became a place of gathering, a sanctuary for teachings and for rites that sought harmony with the unseen. You might imagine standing beneath such a tree, its trunk wide enough to take the weight of several arms, its branches arching above like the ceiling of a temple. The air is still except for the gentle sway of leaves. It filters in patterns that feel deliberate, almost as if shaped by unseen hands. In such a place, the boundary between ritual and nature dissolves. A grove becomes not a location, but a living altar. Stories carried across generations deepened these symbols. Among Celtic traditions, oak groves were believed to house the presence of thunder and sky gods. Lightning, when it struck, often chose the oak, its tall form inviting the fire from above. Rather than seeing this as destruction, people viewed it as a sign of connection, the heavens reaching down to touch the earth through the oak's body. The scars left by lightning on its bark became sacred marks, not wounds, as though proof of communion. Mistletoe's role extended into visions of healing and resurrection. Ancient sources tell of potions made with its leaves or berries, carefully prepared and offered for ailments. Though the plant could be dangerous if used wrongly, this danger was part of its mystery. The boundary between poison and cure, between death and life, mirrored the thin veil between the seen and unseen. For the Druids, mastery of such plants was not just knowledge, but a form of wisdom, the ability to hold balance with reverence. The presence of mistletoe also influenced how people thought of fate. It grew unpredictably, appearing only on certain trees, never by human hand. This rarity made it a symbol of destiny, not to be controlled, only to be received. Its appearance was considered a gift, and so communities treated it as a sign that the gods had not withdrawn, but still spoke, still reached into the world of men through the language of nature. In later traditions, echoes of this reverence survived, though transformed. The custom of hanging mistletoe in homes for protection or using it in winter festivals stretches back to these older roots. What once was gathered under ritual silence found its way into new customs, softened across centuries, yet still carrying the sense of blessing. Even now, when people stand beneath it and exchange gestures of goodwill, they unconsciously echo the ancient belief that mistletoe binds life together, holds misfortune at bay, and bridges what is fragile with what is eternal. The oak, too, has remained a cultural anchor long after the age of Druids passed. It is still a symbol of strength, endurance, and rootedness. Nations adopted it as emblem, poets spoke of it in verse, and villages named themselves in its honor. Yet beneath all these layers, its most ancient meaning lingers. A reminder that to stand beneath its branches was once to stand in the presence of the sacred. As centuries passed, the rituals that bound oak and mistletoe together faded into memory. But memory itself holds power. It allows symbols to remain alive even when their original ceremonies are lost. To speak of them now is to reopen a doorway into a way of seeing, the world in which nature was never silent, never mere backdrop. Instead, every tree and every plant carried a voice, a place in the order of things. And so the oak and the mistletoe remain not only as botanical forms, but as signs. Sign of how ancient people listened, watched, and found meaning in what grew around them. They remind us that strength and mystery, permanence and fragility, the rooted and the suspended, all have a place in the web of the sacred. Perhaps in quiet moments, one might still imagine standing beneath an oak's vast canopy, seeing a cluster of mistletoe glimmering in its branches, rare and luminous. In that stillness, something of the old reverence stirs, not loud, not demanding, but present, like a whisper carried by leaves. Chapter 5. Rituals. Beneath the moon night settles over the ancient groves. The trees stand tall, their branches moving gently, as though stirred by a breath that is older than wind. Beneath them, the Druids gather. They wait until the last traces of daylight have faded and the sky has surrendered to the rule of the moon. To them, the night is not emptiness, it is fullness. A sacred time when silence holds the shape of ritual and shadows carry memory. The Druids follow a calendar woven not into parchment, but into the very fabric of the seasons. Each night, ceremony rests within this rhythm. The cycles of the sun, the tilt of the moon, the turning of stars, all dictate when to light the sacred fire, when to raise the chant, and when to let silence speak more loudly than any human voice. Nothing is random. Every movement, every breath falls in step with a greater order. The solstices are their markers. At the summer solstice, when the light lingers longest, Druids climb to open places where horizon meets horizon. Fires are set, offerings made, and prayers whispered to ensure balance between the earth and the sky. At the winter solstice, when night rules the longest hours, the rituals turn inward. They gather in groves of oak, mistletoe still gleaming against the cold, and seek renewal where the world seems most asleep. These vigils are not for spectacle. They are slow, enduring acts of waiting, acts of faith that the sun will return, and with it, the breath of life. Between these great hinges of the year, the equinoxes offer another kind of stillness. Druids treat them as thresholds. Equal hours of day and night remind them that life is not only a struggle between light and darkness, but a moment when both may rest together in fragile harmony. To stand beneath the equinox moon is to stand at the balance point of creation. The Druids do not hurry these moments. They let them unfold as the moon drifts across the sky, as the earth turns beneath their feet. Objects of ritual carry their own quiet language. The sickle, curved like the crescent moon, harvests mistletoe from the oak without letting it fall to the ground. Bronze cauldrons filled with water or offerings reflect starlight as though the heavens themselves have descended into their vessels. White cloths draped over altars or spread beneath branches mark the boundary between sacred action and the common world. Each object is not an instrument alone, but a vessel of meaning. To hold it is to hold centuries of whispered prayer. Sacrifice, too, is present, though not always as later stories imagined. Sometimes it is the offering of grain, poured carefully into the earth. Sometimes it is milk, honey, or wine left where roots twist into darkness. And sometimes it is blood, given from animals carrying life back into the soil that sustains all. For the Druids, sacrifice is never waste. It is exchange. It is acknowledgement that to live is to take, and to honor is to give. You begin to sense how the night gathers around these acts. The moonlight does not reveal everything. It conceals just enough. The Druids lean into this mystery. They believe the unseen is as real as what stands before their eyes. To perform ritual beneath the moon is to stand between worlds, half in the visible, half in the invisible. You can imagine yourself there, breathing the same night air, hearing the low hum of chants carried on the wind. The prayers are rarely loud. They are spoken softly, often in words that no longer exist in living memory. They rise and fall with rhythm more than sound. A chant might repeat until the boundary between voice and silence blurs, until those gathered feel not as separate bodies, but as one presence moving in the night. Fire adds its glow to the moon's light. Flames are tended with care, fed not with ordinary wood, but with branches chosen for their purity. Some accounts speak of 9 woods, each linked to a different force of nature, fed in careful sequence to ensure harmony. The fire is not only warmth against the cool of night. It is a living witness, carrying prayers upward in smoke, downward in ash, outward in light. These moonlit rituals are more than ceremony. They are a calendar written in action. Every movement teaches memory. Every chant preserves knowledge that is never placed into scrolls or stone, but carried instead in repetition. In this way, the Druids create continuity, a thread linking the past to the present, the living to the unborn. You might picture the circle of people standing in the grove. Some lift their hands to the moon. Others stand in stillness, eyes lowered, listening. The air is heavy with pine and smoke. The rhythm of breath slows not only because of fatigue, but because the ritual itself teaches patience. Nothing needs to be rushed. In the presence of moon and oak, time feels different. Less like a line, more like a circle. Animals move quietly at the edge of the clearing. An owl calls from a branch above, echoing through the night. To the Druids, these are not interruptions. They are signs woven into the pattern of ritual itself. Every rustle, every sound of wing or paw is noticed. They are reminders that the sacred is not apart from the natural, but within it. Sometimes rituals last until dawn. When the first light touches the horizon, the gathering does not simply end. Instead, silence deepens. The Druids watch, waiting for that moment when the sun's first edge appears. Only then do they release their prayers fully, letting them dissolve into the rising day. It is not a conclusion, but a return, a slow exhale back into the ordinary rhythm of life. What remains is the memory of the night. Not a memory of spectacle or of noise, but of presence. To stand beneath the moon in ritual is to stand inside a question, not seeking quick answers, but resting in the mystery that the moon has always known. And as the grove empties, the fires burn low, and the moon slips toward the horizon, a final thought lingers like the last breath of smoke. What do humans truly give back to the night that cradles them? Chapter 6. The Druid as judge and teacher. The figure of the Druid stands not only in the forest's hush, but also in the very center of the ancient community. These were not men and women apart, hidden only in ritual or secret groves. They were the arbiters of law, the carriers of memory, and the teachers who guided the young into the patterns of their people's world. To understand them is to glimpse the threads that held Celtic life together. When disputes rose between clans, it was the Druid who stepped forward, not with the sword, nor with wealth, but with words and memory. They judged by recalling laws carried not in written texts, but in the human mind. Generations of rulings and customs lived inside them, spoken aloud with precision. To forget was unthinkable, for their society trusted them to preserve order through memory alone. In a world where writing was rare and knowledge fragile, their role was a living archive. Picture a gathering in the dim light of dawn. Warriors set aside their pride, farmers their tools, women their grievances, all to stand before the Druid's presence. His judgment was not hurried. He listened, and he weighed not merely what was said, but the unseen forces beneath. To rule was not only to balance facts, but to restore harmony. A wrong decision was more than unfair. It risked unbalancing the delicate ties of kinship, land and spirit. You imagine the stillness as his voice falls, carrying both authority and calm. No parchment recorded his words, yet the people remembered them. Each ruling became another stone in the unseen foundation of their law. With this, Druids became both judges and guardians, binding society with invisible cords of order. Beyond the courts of men, their teaching reached the youth. To be chosen as a student of a Druid was to enter a demanding path. Their lessons stretched across years. Some accounts speak of 20 years of study before mastery. The knowledge was vast: astronomy, the cycles of the sun and moon, the healing properties of herbs, the verses of ancient songs, the hidden structure of language, but above all, they trained the memory. Words carried no weight on parchment, only in the mind. Students learned not by writing, but by repetition, by rhythm, by breath. They recited until the body itself remembered. The spoken word became more than sound. It was a vessel of permanence, carrying wisdom through centuries of fragile human life. This discipline created more than scholars. It shaped philosophers who pondered what lay beyond the senses. Roman writers, who looked upon the Druids with both admiration and suspicion, recorded that they discussed the stars, the motion of the cosmos, the nature of the soul. In a time when fear of death haunted daily life, their teaching of immortality offered comfort. They spoke of the soul as something enduring, passing through transformations rather than endings. This belief softened the sharp edge of mortality, turning death into transition. For their people, this philosophy did more than console. It gave courage. A warrior who believed his soul would live again could fight without fear. A farmer who knew his essence outlasted the body could plant seeds with patience beyond one lifetime. In this way, philosophy became the quiet structure behind both courage and endurance. Yet their teaching was not abstract alone. It was woven into the rhythms of earth. A druid trained his students to read the sky for omens of weather, to track the lengthening of shadows, to measure time, to mark the solstice with stones set against the horizon. These practices were not mystical illusions, they were science, tied to survival. The line between sacred and practical blurred, for to understand nature was to honor it. You begin to feel how knowledge itself was sacred, guarded with care, never freely given. The Romans were astonished that Druids forbade writing down their teachings. They feared that the written word would weaken the mind, that reliance on script would erode memory. So they kept their wisdom oral, flowing like a hidden river, known only to those within the circle of training. In this secrecy lay both strength and fragility. As judges, Druids could excommunicate, a punishment feared more than fines or wounds. To be cut off from ritual, from blessing, from the approval of the spiritual class, was to lose one's place in the fabric of life. The community itself turned cold around the outcast. Such was the weight of their authority, rooted not in armies, but in belief and memory. Philosophers of Rome compared them to their own thinkers, noting similarities to Pythagoras, who also taught of the soul's journey through many lives. Whether these parallels were real or imagined, they reveal how the Druids struck their observers as thinkers, not merely priests of ritual. They stood at the crossing of law, religion, and philosophy, embodying a role few others could hold. In times of conflict between tribes, it was sometimes Druids who stepped forward as mediators. Their words held weight greater than kings. They sought not victory, but balance, urging peace when violence threatened to consume all. To persuade a warrior chief to lower his weapon required not only courage, but deep authority. Such was the respect they commanded, drawn from their perceived closeness to truth. You can almost sense how their presence stitched together the seen and unseen. To judge was to mend broken ties between families. To teach was to plant knowledge in minds that would outlive the teacher himself. To ponder the soul was to give shape to mysteries that haunted every human life. In their role, the Druids reveal a truth often forgotten, that knowledge, law, and spirit cannot be easily divided. Their society wove them together until each became inseparable from the other. To remove one strand was to unravel the whole. The fire burns low in the grove, voices fading to silence. Judgment has been given, lessons spoken, philosophy shared beneath the stars. Yet the presence of the Druid lingers, not in words alone, but in the weight of memory that refuses to fade. And you are left with a question, as soft as night itself. What does it mean for wisdom to live only in the mind? And what do we lose when memory is no longer trusted to hold it? Chapter 7. Songs, Memory, and Oral Tradition. The Druids left behind no written scripture. Their teachings, their laws, their visions of the soul and the unseen world passed only through voices, carried from breath to breath. What survives of them in memory is not carved in stone, nor etched upon scrolls, but whispered by the endurance of human tongues. In the quiet gatherings beneath oak and ash, words rose like flame and descended like rain. Each phrase lived only as long as a voice held it, then was reborn in the ear of another. In this way, the Druids bound themselves to the living cycle of memory. Knowledge was never an object to be stored. It was a presence, renewed each time it was spoken. An apprentice entered this world of learning with no ink, no parchment, no script to follow. For years, sometimes for decades, the task was simple and endless: to listen, to repeat, to remember. Some traditions say the training lasted 20 years. Imagine what that means: 20 winters, 20 summers, where each day the mind was tested like a vessel, filled with lines of verse, laws of kinship, tales of creation, and hymns of praise. The verses themselves were not plain statements. They were woven into rhythm, into cadence, into song. This was no accident. Rhythm clings to the mind. The rise and fall of tone, the repetition of sound, becomes a net that catches memory. Just as a river shapes stone, the pattern of sound shapes thought, guiding it into grooves that hold firm even after decades. The Druids knew that to write a teaching would trap it in stillness, but to sing it was to keep it alive. Every repetition altered slightly with voice, with breath, with time. Knowledge was not fixed, but flowing, like the seasons, like the stars overhead, that changed each night, yet returned in their cycle. There was also a sacred caution. To write was to risk exposing what was meant only for the chosen. A scroll can be stolen. A tablet can be broken and carried away. But memory cannot be seized. It is carried only within those prepared to hold it, those bound to the discipline of silence and restraint. The Romans, who saw this practice from the outside, marveled at it. They wrote that the Druids refused to commit their deepest teachings to script, even while they trained endlessly in letters for mundane tasks. To them, sacred knowledge demanded a living guardian, not a lifeless page. In this way, the act of remembering became itself a kind of offering, a devotion measured not in temples or statues, but in years of disciplined recall. You might feel the weight of such a task, to carry not only stories of gods, but the laws of tribes, the judgments of disputes, the secrets of the soul's journey. Imagine lying awake in the silence of night, verses circling in your mind, each word needing to be placed exactly where it belongs. A single forgotten phrase could unravel meaning. A misplaced line could distort a law. Memory was both burden and honor, and yet there is a deep gentleness to this way. To remember in song is not to hold a rigid archive. It is to dwell in the rhythm of something greater than oneself. The apprentice was not merely storing knowledge, but joining in its current, becoming part of a stream that stretched back into the ancient past. The songs themselves were more than instruction. They shaped identity. Each tribe, each family, each lineage found its place within them. History was sung, genealogy recited, victories remembered, losses mourned. In the melody of these verses, people heard who they were. Without parchment, without monuments, identity itself rested in the fragile, powerful vessel of living memory. And so the Druids stood as both keepers of truth and weavers of continuity. Their knowledge was fragile in one sense. A life lost could take whole chapters of wisdom with it. But it was resilient in another. For so long as one voice remained, the chain endured. No conqueror could seize it, no fire could burn it. Think of the silence after the recitation ended, the circle of students, the hush of forest air, the fire low and glowing. What remained was not ink on a page, but the echo inside each listener. That echo lived, waiting to be called again, rising whenever memory summoned it back. The Druids believed that words carried power, that spoken syllables could heal, curse, or bless. To forget was not only to lose information, but to break a chain of power. To remember carefully and faithfully was to preserve the balance of the unseen. This way of knowledge may feel distant now in a world where every thought can be captured and stored. Yet in listening, you may sense the quiet strength it gave, a discipline of patience and intimacy between teacher and student, a trust in the rhythm of human voice, and so the memory remains not in books, but in the imagination of what it means to live by words that vanish even as they are spoken, yet remain alive within those who listen. The fire burns lower. The verse is complete. Silence falls again, and the weight of those unrecorded words drifts gently into the night. Chapter 8. The Sacred Stones of Britain and Ireland. The great stone circles of Britain and Ireland rise from the land like frozen echoes of another age. Their presence is older than the Druids, older even than the myths that later wrapped themselves around their shapes. Yet by the time the Druids walked among them, these stones had already gathered centuries of silence, carrying meanings that no written word preserved. They stood as monuments not of one tribe, but of generations who shaped earth and stone into patterns meant to endure. Stonehenge, perhaps the most famous of these circles, sits on the wide Salisbury Plain. Its arrangement of sarsens and bluestones does not feel accidental. The stones are aligned with the movements of the sun, catching light on the solstices as though the builders wished to bind human time to cosmic rhythm. The Druids did not raise it, yet when they approached its circle, they walked into a place already heavy with sacred direction. A calendar of stone, but also something more, a threshold where human life could touch the eternal. Avebury, larger and less contained than Stonehenge, stretches across fields with stones that appear scattered yet connected. Here, the circle swallows whole villages within its embrace. Walking its perimeter, the sense is not of confinement but of expansion, of a sacred geography mapped upon the earth. Druids who visited this place may have felt themselves entering a landscape where ritual did not simply happen, it was shaped by the very bones of the land. You picture standing there, the wind moving across grass and every stone holding silence that has outlived centuries. Across the sea, in Ireland, Newgrange rises not as a circle of standing stones but as a great mound, a passage tomb built with precise design. Its entrance aligns with the winter solstice sunrise, sending a blade of light deep into the dark chamber. This is architecture made for memory, for the passage of souls, for the meeting of light and death. Though thousands of years older than the Druids, its presence was never ignored. For those who sought wisdom, such places carried whispers of the ancestors, echoes of journeys already made. The Druids had no scripture, but they had these monuments. They had landscapes carved by ancient hands, where earth and sky were bound together. To step into such places was to step into a story that had no beginning and no end. The stones held memory not in words, but in weight, in shadow, in alignment with the heavens. Each circle, each mound, seemed to say that the world itself was a sacred text, read not with ink and page, but with the rising sun and the arc of the seasons. You imagine yourself within these circles, not as a tourist, but as one who carries questions too heavy for ordinary places. The stones do not answer in language, yet they do not remain silent. They answer in the way they hold space, in how they frame the horizon, in how they invite stillness. A person among them becomes smaller, yet more complete. The Druids, keepers of memory and ritual, must have felt this contraction and expansion, this sense that the stones contained a map for the spirit as much as for the sky. Legends later tied the Druids directly to Stonehenge, imagining them as architects or magicians who moved the stones through spell or chant. But the truth is more subtle. They inherited these circles as one inherits a forgotten library, filled with texts written in a language no longer spoken. They could not have built them, yet their rituals layered new meaning upon ancient design. The stones did not belong to one age alone. They belonged to all who stood among them, seeking alignment with something greater than themselves. Archaeologists read these places in terms of function: observatories, burial grounds, ceremonial sites. The Druids likely saw them as all of these at once, but also more: thresholds between visible and invisible, markers that bound a community to cycles larger than human life. Every solstice gathering, every ritual chant was amplified by stone that had already witnessed centuries of worship. In that sense, the Druids and the stones became partners in sacred time. Consider Avebury again, its avenues of paired stones stretching outward like veins of ritual energy. To walk them would be to move through a ceremonial path, one that began not in the mind but in the body. The Druids, masters of rhythm and voice, may have woven chant with movement, binding sound to the geometry of stone. What was spoken vanished into air, but the stones remained, absorbing memory without word. Newgrange, with its inner chamber lit only at the solstice, carries a different weight. Here, darkness is absolute until pierced by the returning sun. To those who entered, the experience would not be symbolic, but physical. The body pressed into shadow, the sudden flood of light entering like breath after long silence. For the Druids, even if they came centuries later, such a place would be unmistakably sacred. It was proof that human hands could shape a space where death and rebirth were not theories, but lived realities. In all these monuments, what endures is presence. The stones do not explain themselves. They simply remain, enduring wind and rain, marking cycles beyond human memory. Their silence is not absence, but fullness, a reminder that the sacred does not need words to endure. The Druids, who lived by memory and recitation, must have understood this deeply. They carried words in their minds, yet they also stood among these silent teachers who said everything without speaking. Tonight, as you imagine resting among these stones, you sense what they offer is not explanation, but companionship. The earth has shifted, civilizations have risen and fallen, but the circles still stand. They do not promise answers. They promise only presence. The steady, immovable reminder that time is both fleeting and eternal. And as the last light fades across the plain, the stones remain, holding silence that is older than memory, waiting for those who still seek to listen. Chapter 9. The Isle of Anglesey. Anglesey lies off the northwestern coast of Wales, a land separated from the mainland by a narrow strait of restless waters. In the time of the ancient Celts, this island carries more than fields, forests, and stone. It carries the heartbeat of Druidic practice, preserved longer here than in any other place. When the power of Rome spreads across Britain, Anglesey becomes the final stronghold, a sanctuary where memory and ritual still breathe. The Druids are not simply priests, they are judges, teachers, healers, and keepers of stories. In their hands rests the weight of tradition that binds communities together. Anglesey, with its thick groves and remote position, offers them the perfect shelter. To the Romans, this island represents more than geography. It represents defiance. It is a place where native belief stands unbroken, where sacred groves defy imperial order. The island's oak forests stretch deep and silent. Within these groves, ceremonies unfold in rhythms older than empire. Druids gather, their voices rising with chants that echo across the stillness. Here, oaths are spoken, judgments are delivered, and memory itself is preserved. The people of Britain carry their disputes to these men, trusting them more than kings, more than chieftains. And on Anglesey, these practices continue while Rome presses closer. For Roman governors and generals, Anglesey is not only a target of war, but a symbol to erase. To conquer the island is to sever the spiritual root of resistance. Historical accounts describe legions preparing to cross the waters, armed not only for battle but for destruction. They do not march only to seize land, they march to silence. Belief. Tacitus, the Roman historian, records how soldiers approached the island's shores. They see women dressed in black, their hair streaming, torches lifted high. They hear the cries of Druids, hands raised, calling down curses. To disciplined Roman troops, it is a vision meant to terrify. And yet the legions advance, and they burn the groves, they put people to the sword. Fire consumes wood and ritual alike. What once shelters centuries of devotion falls to ash. Still memory lingers. The island remains scarred, but not silent. Even as Rome claims victory, whispers of the Druids endure. Belief does not vanish in a single campaign. It moves into hidden places, preserved in fragments of story, in quiet practice among those who survive. The groves may be lost, yet the memory of them becomes its own kind of sanctuary. You imagine standing on Anglesey now, centuries later. The wind sweeps across the fields, carrying salt from the sea. Stones lie scattered, some shaped by human hands, others resting where time has placed them. The forests that once echoed with chants have thinned, but in the quiet, you still feel a pulse beneath the ground. It is the weight of memory that resists erasure. Anglesey's history becomes a lesson in resilience. The Druids do not build temples of stone. They trust the living world, the oak, the sky, the flowing river. When fire destroys one place, memory finds another. This is why the island's story survives in fragments, half buried in chronicles, written by conquerors, half remembered in folklore carried by the people. There is a paradox in conquest. Armies can march, destroy, and scatter, but the deeper currents of belief are harder to erase. They remain in the land itself, in the turning of seasons, in the silent awe that rises when one looks across the sea to Anglesey's shores. For Rome, the burning of Anglesey is meant to be final. For those who remember, it becomes a wound, yes, but also a seed. Stories of the Druids, of their courage and their last stand, echo through centuries. They surface again in later ages, romanticized, reimagined, but always tied to this island where resistance once stood firm. You begin to sense how Anglesey is more than a place on a map. It is a threshold between presence and memory. The groves no longer stand as they once did, yet the silence they leave behind holds its own gravity. To walk its ground is to feel both absence and presence at once. In time, Anglesey becomes known, not only for its Druidic past, but also for the resilience of its people. The landscape holds layers: prehistoric tombs, Roman scars, medieval churches, modern villages. Each layer adds to the story, but beneath them all, the memory of the Druids remains like a root that refuses to die. Imagine the night falling. Over the island, the sea darkens and stars scatter above. Somewhere, waves strike against the shore in their endless rhythm. In the stillness, one can almost hear echoes, chants that once filled the groves, cries that rose against the march of soldiers, and the silence that followed when fire swept through the trees. These are not just sounds of the past, they are part of the present quiet woven into the air you breathe. The Isle of Anglesey teaches that memory cannot always be protected by walls or armies. Sometimes it survives only by being carried in hearts, in whispers, in stories passed at night. Conquest can destroy groves, but it cannot fully conquer the human need to believe, to root life in meaning. And so Anglesey continues to rest both sanctuary and grave. It is a place where resistance meets surrender, where fire consumes but does not erase. Its fields and waters hold the stillness of memory, waiting for those who pause long enough to listen. The chapter exhales here, with the sense of an island holding both loss and endurance. Quiet, steady, unbroken. Chapter 10. The Druids and the Romans. Roman voices are among the few that speak of the Druids. They come to us through writings, carved not in stone, but in reports, commentaries, and histories. Each account is shaped by conquest, yet within their words, something else glimmers, an unease, a quiet awe, a recognition that here was a people unlike the rest. Julius Caesar, in his commentaries on the Gallic Wars, offers one of the most detailed early descriptions. He places the Druids at the center of Gallic society. They are judges, teachers, keepers of knowledge. He tells of how disputes are brought before them, how their authority can banish a man from the sacred rites of community, a punishment that leaves him shunned. He writes of their long training, sometimes 20 years or more, as they commit vast bodies of knowledge to memory. Caesar claims they do not write down their teachings, for they believe wisdom must live in the mind, not on the page. The Roman general frames this with admiration, yet also with strategy. His descriptions are not only observation, but justification. To defeat the Gauls, Rome must weaken their leaders. To weaken their leaders, Rome must dismantle the Druids. Later writers echo this pattern. Tacitus, writing of Britain, speaks with a sharper edge. In his Annals, he describes the campaign against Anglesey, that island where Druids found refuge. He recalls Roman soldiers hesitating at the shore, unnerved by the sight before them, women in black, hair loose, raising their hands like furies, Druids lifting their voices in chants, curses spilling into the wind. For a moment, discipline falters. The Roman army recoils, shaken not by sword or spear, but by the presence of belief. Only with command restored do they advance, cutting through sacred groves, turning fire against oak. Tacitus writes this with the clarity of victory, yet within his words rests a truth. Rome feared what it could not fully understand. Pliny the Elder, more curious than Martial, records details of Druidic practice. He speaks of mistletoe gathered with golden sickle, of white-robed priests, of sacred rites held beneath the branches of oak. He frames it as wonder and superstition, but his very choice to record it suggests a fascination. In Rome, where order and law were prized above all, the Druids represented something different, a knowledge woven not from marble halls, but from forest and sky. Each Roman voice carries both bias and revelation. Their accounts are never neutral. They are shaped by empire, by conquest, by the need to explain and diminish. Yet beneath the layers of judgment one hears respect, even envy. A society that could command such loyalty, that could make warriors falter through ritual alone, was a society Rome could not ignore. You imagine those moments when Roman scribes in quiet rooms set down what they had seen. They describe chanting, processions, sacrifices, the weight of ritual. They interpret these acts through their own lens, calling them savage, calling them strange. Yet in the act of writing, they preserve echoes of a people whose voices were never written by their own hand. The silence of the Druids in history is not accidental. Their choice to keep teachings unwritten was a resistance to time's erosion, a commitment to memory as a living vessel. But it also meant that when conquest swept across their lands, their words could not speak back. Only Roman accounts remain, like reflections in a darkened mirror. And yet silence carries its own power. The Romans, in their need to record, reveal their own shadows. By naming the Druids as dangerous, they admit their influence. By destroying groves, they reveal the sanctity they sought to erase. Every attempt to suppress belief leaves a trace of what it tried to bury. You begin to sense the paradox. The conqueror writes the history, but in writing he confesses his own awe. The more Rome sought to dismantle the Druids, the more their memory endured, not through stone monuments, not through scripture, but through the very words meant to condemn them. Even now the accounts linger, part admiration, part fear. The Romans saw in the Druids something they could not absorb into their order. A knowledge bound to cycles of nature, to oaks, to stars, to mysteries carried in the breath of students. A power that lived not in empire, but in the invisible strength of memory. And so the chapter rests between shadow and truth. Roman voices remain loud, but within their echoes you hear another presence. A quiet endurance, a resilience that was never fully broken. Something survives in the silence between their words. A question lingers softly. What did the Romans truly see in those groves that their own pens could never fully capture? Chapter 11. Ireland and the preservation of memory. Ireland rests outside the reach of the Roman legions. The island's green hills and misted valleys remain untouched by the empire's iron roads and stone garrisons. Here, the old ways breathe longer. Here, fragments of Druidic presence do not vanish in the flames of suppression, but linger, quietly woven into memory. The Druids of Ireland are never described directly in Roman accounts. The empire never saw them, never faced them in battle, never burned their groves. Instead, their shadow lives on through whispers of myth and the soft hand of storytelling. The tales that survive are not shaped by conquerors, but by poets and monks who carried forward memory in a different way. When Ireland's first myths are sung, they speak of otherworldly beings and heroic cycles. They echo the kind of wisdom once kept in sacred groves by voices that guided kings and tribes. The earliest stories tell of the Tuatha De Danann, the shining people, the divine race who come from the mist, bearing gifts of knowledge and power. Though later told as myth, their image carries the weight of older reverence, perhaps born from real priestly figures, remembered and transformed. The Irish bards hold the stories in rhythm and verse. Their voices move across centuries, shaping the collective memory of a people who never lost their tongue to the Roman order. In their songs, the line between history and legend bends, but something essential remains: the sense that wisdom is preserved through story, even when the names of those who spoke it first fade away. The sagas of heroes, Tucholin, Fionn Macumhail, and others, hold fragments of an older philosophy. A warrior's courage is praised, but so too is honor, truth, and the bond with the unseen world. These tales do not speak the language of shrines and temples, but they carry a druidic weight. The idea that fate is woven, that prophecy guides, that nature and spirit are never far apart. You sense in these sagas not just entertainment, but remnants of sacred teaching, veiled in story, so it might survive. Centuries later, Christian scribes take up the work of writing. Monks in their quiet scriptoria copy down the oral traditions, carefully pressing memory into vellum. They record myths, genealogies, and sagas that had lived only in breath and voice. Yet in their writing, something curious happens. The monks, devoted to their own faith, preserve tales of gods and heroes they no longer worship. They shape them, sometimes softening, sometimes recasting, but never erasing completely. What was once Druidic wisdom becomes layered, transformed into a hybrid memory. Part pagan, part Christian, yet undeniably Irish. The Book of Invasions, the Lebor Gabala Erin, tells of the many peoples who arrive in Ireland, each wave shaping the land and its destiny. Within it, you find echoes of myth that preserve patterns of thought older than the monks themselves. The Tuatha De Danann descend from the sky, skilled in magic, in healing, in druidic arts. Though the monks write of them as a race overtaken, by later peoples the reverence within the tale remains. They become the cedar, the hidden ones beneath the hills, eternal, watching. Through this, you feel the survival of belief, reshaped, yet alive. Other texts preserve fragments of ritual memory. Triads, short verses that group knowledge into threes, may once have been a teaching tool of Druids, passed orally for ease of recall. In early Irish manuscripts, you find these triads scattered. 3 things that bring ruin, 3 things that bring honor, 3 things not easily hidden. They are simple in form, yet beneath them lies a system of wisdom, a way of remembering, values through rhythm. You imagine a druid's voice teaching in triads by a fire, children repeating after him, holding the words so they would not be lost. Centuries later, when monks record them, the structure remains. In the rhythm of 3, memory finds its preservation. Ireland's distance from Rome also allows the law, traditions to endure. The Brehon laws, recorded much later but rooted in older custom, reveal a society where balance, honor, and restitution are central. These laws show a world in which judgment is not punishment alone, but a restoration of harmony. Many scholars sense within them the breath of Druidic thought, reworked through time but still bearing that ancient concern with order. Not the order of empire, but of kinship and nature. As you reflect, you notice how memory survives not by resisting change but by adapting. Druidic presence in Ireland does not remain whole. It transforms, bends, hides within new forms. In myths, it becomes story. In laws, it becomes code. In triads, it becomes rhythm. In Christian manuscripts, it becomes preserved within the very faith that once sought to silence it elsewhere. The survival of Druidic echoes in Ireland also tells of the human need to carry wisdom forward. Even when beliefs shift, even when gods change, the shape of ancient memory still calls to those who live close to the land. The mist over Irish hills, the stones standing in circles, the sound of rivers all hold the weight of stories that outlast conquest. You may sense as you listen, that memory itself has a kind of spirit. It lingers in the soil, in the air, in the stories told by the hearth. Ireland becomes a vessel for memory, not because it resists time, but because it allows the old and the new to live side by side. The monks write of Christ, yet they also copy the sagas of the Tuatha De Danann. The people attend Mass, yet they tell stories of Fionn by the fire. This blending does not erase the Druids, it carries them quietly into another age. Perhaps this is why Irish tradition feels so layered, so rich with echoes. Beneath the Christian surface lies a deeper hum, a resonance of an older voice. You can almost feel it in the rhythm of the language, in the cadence of the old Gaelic tongue, in the shape of its poetry. The Druids may have passed, but their wisdom lingers in sound, in lore, in story, preserved in ways the Romans could never erase. In the silence of Ireland's green hills, memory itself becomes sacred ground. And you wonder, how much of what? You know today is shaped by voices that once stood in sacred groves, whispering truths to the wind, trusting the land itself to remember. Chapter 12. The Soul and the Afterlife. The Druids held death not as a closing door, but as an opening passage. In their teachings, the soul was not fragile, not bound to a single span of years, but enduring. To them, the body was a vessel, a temporary garment, while the soul was a traveler moving through unseen realms. When one life ended, another awaited, or another place opened its gates. Classical writers who glimpsed the Druids left fragments of this belief. Julius Caesar recorded that the Gauls believed the soul did not perish, but passed into another body. For him, it was a striking claim, one that gave warriors courage to face battle without fear. If death was not final, then even the grave could not defeat them. Yet Caesar's words are filtered through his own Roman mind. What he saw as strange. Confidence may have been, for the Druids, a simple truth. Other voices from antiquity repeat the same echoes. Lucan, the Roman poet, spoke of the Druids teaching that death was merely the middle of a long road, and that eternity stretched out like a river without end. This teaching, if it is faithful, tells of a people who viewed existence as circular, not linear. Life flowed into death, and death into life again. Within Celtic myth itself, signs of this teaching appear in hidden ways. Heroes enter otherworldly realms through mist or through water, never truly dying but shifting into a place beyond the reach of ordinary eyes. In the tale of Cu Chulainn, there are visions of the hero's fate that seem more like transformation than erasure. In the story of Oisin, the mortal who journeyed to Tir na Nog, the land of youth, time bent and life stretched beyond its normal measure. The soul, then, was thought to move in more than one direction. Some traditions hinted at rebirth, the soul taking form again in a new body, perhaps even among kin. A warrior fallen in battle could be reborn as a child within the tribe, carrying the same spirit but new flesh. Others spoke of the soul journeying into the other world, a place where gods, spirits, and ancestors gathered. These were not contradictions, but parallel streams, each carrying the soul into continuation. You imagine how such a belief softened the silence of death, to stand at the side of a loved one's burial and feel not only grief, but assurance that the soul traveled onward would have given mourning a different shape. The grave was not the final resting place, but a threshold. The cairns and mounds that still rise from the Irish hills may have been seen not only as tombs, but as doors, openings to the other world through which the departed stepped. This other world was not imagined as distant. It touched the edges of daily life. In Irish myth, it could be entered by stepping into a lake, by walking into a cave, or by crossing a sea mist. It was close enough to touch, yet hidden by a veil. There the soul did not suffer loss. Time was gentle, seasons eternal. Death, then, was less an end than a change of dwelling. For the Druids, such belief also shaped how life was lived. If the soul endured, then choices mattered deeply. Honor, courage, truth. These were not temporary virtues, but qualities carried beyond the body. What one did in this life shaped the course of the soul's journey. Injustice, cowardice, or betrayal would cling, while integrity traveled like light through lifetimes. Later Christian scribes recording Irish tales often wove these older beliefs with their own theology. The idea of an eternal soul passing into reward or punishment harmonized with the Druidic vision, though the details differed. Yet in the blend, one still hears the older rhythm, the sense that life continues, that spirit is never broken. When you sit with these thoughts, you feel the weight of time lessen. To imagine that death is not final, but simply another horizon, is to live with gentler steps. The Druids seem to carry that gentleness into their teaching. To them, the unseen world was not fearful, but natural. The mysteries of the soul were not written down in their own words, but they endure in fragments of poetry, in the shadows of myths, in the reports of others who tried to understand them. These fragments are enough to remind us, for the Druids, death was never defeat. It was movement, it was transition, and as you let that thought settle, it lingers like a low tide, like a whisper left behind by those who believed with certainty that the soul does not end but flows, always onward. Chapter 13. Sacred animals and omens. In the sacred world of the Druids, animals are not only creatures of the earth, they are messengers, companions, and living signs of the mysteries that move unseen. Each feather, each paw print, each shadow that drifts across the ground carries meaning, and in those meanings the Druids find guidance. To them, the world speaks constantly, not in words, but in gestures, in movement, in the quiet patterns of life that fold into nature's rhythm. The raven is one of the most enduring of these voices, black-feathered, sharp-eyed, circling high. Above, it is not seen as an omen of dread alone, but as a bridge between the visible and the hidden. Its flight across the sky is watched with care, for it might mark a change in fortune, a warning of battle, or a sign of protection. When a raven calls, its sound is not dismissed as ordinary. It is understood as layered, carrying the weight of spirits and ancestors who linger close. In Celtic tradition, the raven often stands with the goddesses of war and fate, especially the Morrigan. To see ravens gather on the field before conflict is to know that the outcome has already been spoken in the language of wings and cries. Yet beyond blood and strife, the raven is also a guardian of knowledge. Its dark form carries secrets, and in its intelligence the Druids sense not only danger but wisdom, as though it carries messages between realms. The stag holds a gentler place. White stags, in particular, are said to wander between worlds. To encounter such a creature is rare and profound, as though the forest itself has parted to reveal a passage into the unseen. The stag is a guide, calling the soul onward, deeper into the mysteries of spirit. In stories, the chase of the stag is never just a hunt. It is a journey, a pursuit that pulls one across thresholds of time and meaning. The antlers themselves are seen as sacred. Branching upward like living trees, they remind the Druids of the way life renews, grows, and sheds again and again. To touch an antler is to feel the cycle of the seasons, the strength of the earth moving into the bone, of a creature that roams freely beneath the sky. The stag becomes a lesson to walk with quiet strength, to move through life's forests with patience, yet always aware of the unseen path just ahead. Birds of many kinds serve as messengers. Their flights are studied with care, their calls listened to as though each note carried instruction. The Druid does not hear the song of a bird as simple music. Instead, it is part of a language that the world itself speaks. A bird flying north or landing suddenly before one's path could shift the meaning of an entire day. The air becomes scripture, written not in ink, but in wings. Crows, like ravens, share the role of watchers. They gather in groups, their black forms stark against the green fields. In their numbers lies both mystery and caution. To see them feast upon the fallen is to remember the closeness of death. Yet their cleverness, their ability to thrive, also shows the strength of transformation. Death, to the Druids, is not final. It is a step into another turning of life. The crows remind them that endings are always beginnings. The boar, fierce and untamed, is honored as well. In Celtic tales, the wild boar is a beast of courage, often hunted not only for food, but for the trial of facing its strength. Its bristles rise like spears, and its charge demands respect. For the Druids, the boar carries the spirit of challenge. To face life's trials directly, to enter the thicket without hesitation. In some traditions, feasts of boar are sacred, the meat a gift of endurance and resilience shared among those who gather in ritual. The horse is another companion, one tied not only to movement, but to the sacred rhythm of cycles. Horses draw chariots of gods and heroes, their hooves striking the earth in a steady beat like the pulse of time. They carry warriors into battle and kings into ceremony, yet their role is not only of power. In the quiet moments they are linked to the sun's journey, to fertility, and to the flowing strength of rivers. A horse seen in dream or vision may be a sign of transition, a reminder that the soul too is carried forward, step by step. Dogs, loyal and watchful, accompany hunters and travelers, but they are also tied to the spirit world. In certain myths, spectral hounds are said to appear at the edges of the unseen, guiding souls or chasing those who wander astray. To live with a dog is to share life with a protector who senses more than human eyes can grasp. Their ears prick at sounds that lie beyond the ordinary, and in this attentiveness they remind the Druids of the closeness between the living and the hidden. Snakes and serpents, too, weave into this sacred order. Sliding silently across the earth, they embody both danger and healing. Their skin is shed, and in this act of renewal the Druids see the cycle of life and rebirth. Some Celtic symbols show serpents entwined, forming endless knots, signs of eternity, of life looping back upon itself. To encounter a serpent is to be reminded that all things change, and that from each change, life begins anew. Fish, especially, the salmon hold wisdom. The salmon of knowledge in Celtic legend swims in the waters of the otherworld, carrying secrets of creation in its flesh. To eat of such a fish is to gain understanding beyond measure. In this story, the salmon becomes a living well of truth, a reminder that wisdom does not rest only in books or in speech, but in the natural world itself. Every stream, every pool might carry the reflection of a lesson waiting to be found. Each animal, whether fierce or gentle, winged or walking, carries a thread that ties the visible world to the unseen. The Druids do not see them as ornaments of story, but as living signs that walk beside humanity. When an animal appears in a dream or crosses one's path in waking life, it is not dismissed as chance. It is a visitation, a whisper from the deeper order of things. You might imagine standing at the edge of a forest clearing. The air is still, the light fading, when suddenly a white stag steps into view. It does not speak, yet its presence says, "Enough." You feel called to follow, though you know not where it will lead. This is how the Druids read the world, with trust that signs, when they appear, are not empty. They are guides, each one carrying a piece of the great story. And so ravens circle, stags wander, horses thunder, and serpents coil. Each movement is a sentence, each cry a word. The earth is alive with language, waiting for those who listen. Perhaps even now you wonder what signs walk beside you, unnoticed yet near. Chapter 14. Water, rivers, and sacred wells. Across the ancient lands of the Celts, water is not just a resource, not simply a stream to drink from or a river to cross. It is living presence. It breathes, it remembers, it carries voices between the worlds. To the Druid, every current is alive with spirit, and every well is an opening into the deep. The Boyne, winding through the heart of Ireland, holds a place of reverence unlike any other. Its waters are said to be born of wisdom, flowing from a mythical well where hazelnut trees dropped their sacred fruit. Salmon fed on those nuts, and in turn their flesh became heavy with knowledge. Legends tell of poets and seers who sought this wisdom, who believed that drinking from such waters could grant insight beyond mortal reach. As the river curves across the green hills, it carries the sense of something more than water, a thread of prophecy, a current of memory stretching back before history itself. Rivers to the Druids are more than lines across a map. They are boundaries, thresholds, and living companions. They mark where one territory ends and another begins, not only in the land but in the unseen. To cross a river is often to step into another realm, to shift your state of being. Many Celtic tales begin at the edge of a ford, where warriors pause before battle or where lovers meet in secrecy. It is here, in the shallow crossings, that the seen and the unseen lean close to one another, like two banks held apart by only a narrow stream. You picture yourself standing on such a bank. The water runs cool and clear, its voice steady and unhurried. As you listen, you begin to sense why ancient people saw prophecy in these sounds. The endless repetition, the subtle changes in rhythm, the way light bends and scatters across the surface. It all feels like a language, not one of words, but of patterns and whispers. To be still by a river is to hear not just water, but something older, moving patiently beneath. Sacred wells, too, carry deep meaning. Unlike rivers, which journey endlessly across the land, wells are still places, yet no less alive. They are points of descent, where water rises from hidden depths, as though carrying messages from the underworld or the womb of the earth itself. To drink from such a source was to touch something pure, untouched by the surface world, to drop. Offerings into it was to send prayers downward, entrusting them to the unseen forces below. Across Ireland and Britain, hundreds of wells became tied to stories of gods, saints, and spirits. Some were said to cure illness if you drank from them at dawn. Others were places of vision, where one might look into the water and glimpse what has not yet come to pass. Many still remain, tucked away by ruined churches or forgotten fields, their stones worn smooth by centuries of hands reaching for water. Among these, certain wells were linked to goddesses of healing and fertility. Boann, the goddess who gave, her name to the River Boyne is one such figure. Her story tells of approaching the well of wisdom against forbidden rules, circling it until its waters rose and burst forth, forming the great river. In that tale, the act of defiance is not destruction, but creation. Wisdom spilling into the land, knowledge carried outward for all to share. Every stream that joins the Boyne is, in a sense, a continuation of that first overflowing. The Druids held ceremonies at rivers and wells, knowing them as places where communication with the divine was thinnest. Offerings of jewelry, weapons, and carved figures have been discovered in their depths, deliberately placed rather than lost. A sword bent beyond use, a brooch heavy with design, or coins pressed together, all lowered into the water, not for human use, but as gifts into the unseen current. To leave something in water was to trust it to spirit, to let it pass beyond ownership and into relationship. You imagine such a ritual at dusk, the light fading, the surface of the well mirroring, only the pale glow of sky. A small circle of people gathered, quiet, reverent. One by one they step forward, releasing what they carry into the depths. No splash is loud here, only soft rings spreading outward, as though the well itself has taken the offering into its breath. You sense the humility in such gestures, not asking for reward, but acknowledging presence, acknowledging power. Water also served as a tool of divination. In the quiet ripple of a stream, in the way leaves drift across its flow, Druids read signs. Wells, with their reflective stillness, were gazed into like mirrors, a practice later echoed in scrying with bowls of water or polished surfaces. The human mind, stilled by the constant presence of water, could begin to open in ways ordinary life did not allow. In the endless flow, one sees patterns. In the still pool, one sees depth. But water was not only gentle, not only healing, it also demanded respect. Floods could sweep away entire settlements. Fords, deceptively calm, could pull the strongest warrior under. To honor water was also to fear it, not with dread, but with acknowledgement. The same force that nourished. The crops could also reclaim the land. In this dual nature, the Druids saw reflection of the sacred balance, and death, healing and destruction always entwined. Rivers were often imagined as goddesses themselves, flowing bodies of spirit that carried both generosity and warning. To stand by them was to stand in the presence of something vast, a being whose patience stretched beyond lifetimes. Offerings were not just ritual but relationship, gestures of reciprocity toward a presence always watching, always moving. In time, with the coming of Christianity, many of these wells were rededicated to saints, yet the rituals continued. People still tied cloth to trees beside the springs, still left coins or pins as small offerings, still drank or bathed in the water for healing. The names changed, but the reverence endured. The land remembers, and so do the waters. As you listen now, the steady voice of water feels unending. Whether in the rush of a river or the silence of a hidden spring, it carries memory. It carries presence. The ancients paused here, trusting water as both path and teacher. You too can pause to sense how even now the streams and wells around the world still hold the same quiet power. And perhaps as you close your eyes to the sound of water moving through stone and soil, you begin to wonder, what truths still flow beneath the surface, waiting to rise? Chapter 15. The Bardic Tradition. The figure of the bard stands at the threshold between memory and sound. In ancient Celtic society, these men and women held more than a role of entertainment. They were guardians of tradition, carriers of stories, and preservers of sacred order. Their voices rose not only to recall battles or honor kings, but to keep alive the rhythms that bound people to land, to ancestors, and to the divine. The bardic order was closely tied to the Druids, yet it was distinct. Where the Druid dealt in ritual, sacrifice, and the mysteries of lore, the bard carried the heart of the people through poetry and music. Theirs was a form of priesthood in sound, where each word shaped identity and each melody stretched across generations. Their power rested not only in memory but in mastery of rhythm. Verse was carefully structured, guided by meters and patterns that mirrored natural cycles, the rise and fall of seasons, the ebb and flow of tides. To listen was to enter into a rhythm larger than oneself, a cadence that seemed to draw the mind toward the eternal. In the courts of kings, bards were honored above warriors. Their words could immortalize a ruler or condemn him to ridicule that lingered for centuries. Praise poetry was a form of consecration, satire, a curse as sharp as steel. A bard's tongue, it was said, could raise armies or scatter them, not by force of weapon, but through sound alone. Much of their lore was not written down. Instead, it lived in memory, passed from one generation to the next. Apprentices trained for years, sometimes for decades, learning hundreds of tales, genealogies, and songs. Memory was sacred, and to lose a story was to break a chain of ancestry, to let a thread unravel in the vast tapestry of time. The bard's role stretched beyond performance. In legal disputes, their knowledge of lineage determined rightful inheritance. In tribal assemblies, their songs reminded people of promises once sworn, or of ancient precedents that held the weight of law. In ritual spaces, their verses carried invocations that blurred the line between poetry and prayer. You might imagine a quiet night by firelight where a single voice rises in song. The embers glow, the faces of listeners soften, and the cadence carries them far beyond the circle of flame. The bard becomes not merely a singer, but a vessel. Through the rhythm of words, the past enters the present, and the unseen grows near. The music itself was more than accompaniment. Harps, lyres, and pipes added layers of sound, shaping atmosphere and mood. The harp in particular held deep symbolic value in Celtic lands, its strings believed to echo cosmic harmony. To pluck them was not just to play, it was to touch the order of creation itself, to bring into human hearing what existed eternally in silence. The poetic forms were complex, filled with alliteration, internal rhyme, and layered imagery. They were not casual songs, but carefully crafted vessels, demanding precision and reverence. The sound of a poem was as important as its meaning. To misplace a word was not only an error of memory, but a fracture in sacred rhythm. In Irish tradition, one finds references to three kinds of songs: those of praise, those of lament, and those of sleep or peace. Praise songs lifted rulers and warriors into renown. Laments carried grief across generations, mourning the fallen or the lost. Songs of rest soothed the soul, carrying listeners into calm, much as the very cadence of the bard now drifts toward your own night. Legends describe bards who could silence entire assemblies with a single verse, their words said to carry enchantment. To be placed under the satire of a bard was feared more deeply than battle wounds, for reputation in Celtic culture was life itself. Honor, once lost, rarely returned, and yet their gift was not only fearsome, it was gentle as well. Mothers sang. Lullabies taught by bardic tradition. Communities gathered in festivals where voices intertwined, laughter and story moving together like the flow of a river. The bard's voice could hold both sharpness and balm, depending on the need. In medieval manuscripts, glimpses of their art survive. The Book of Taliesin in Wales preserves verses attributed to a legendary bard, blending myth, praise, and cryptic wisdom. In Ireland, texts like the Book of Leinster capture genealogies and poetic fragments that hint at the immensity of what was once carried purely in human memory. Even in decline, when Christian scribes began to write down what had long been oral, the sense of sacredness endured. The bard was more than a poet. He was a keeper of vibration, shaping not only the stories of a people, but the very rhythm of how they understood the world. You begin to sense how voice itself can become a bridge. Words, when bound to rhythm, echo something beyond language. They steady the mind, they soften the heart, they weave the scattered thoughts of night into a single thread. The bard's craft, though born in another age, brushes against your own silence now. There is a stillness that follows the final note of a song. Listeners hold their breath, eyes softened, as if the world itself has leaned closer. That is the sacred moment the bard carried, not merely the performance, but the hush after, the weight of memory settling upon the spirit. The bardic tradition reminds us that sound is not fleeting. It lingers, it imprints. It shapes the way memory is carried forward. And so the voices of the old ones, though centuries removed, still ripple faintly through time like echoes across a valley. In that faintness, you may sense it now. The distant cadence of words not fully heard, but deeply felt. The song of a bard moving quietly through the night air, never fully gone, never fully silenced. Chapter 16. Seers and Prophecy. In the stillness of ancient groves, among the standing stones and beneath the weight of unbroken skies, there lived a different kind of druid. These were the seers, those who leaned not upon the sword or the law, but upon vision. Their role was not to rule, but to read. They gazed into the language of the world, seeking signs that others passed by, tracing the quiet threads of what was yet to come. The Celtic world did not draw a sharp line between the present and the future. Time was not a straight road, but a circle unfolding in rhythms like the seasons. A seer was not one who forced open the future, but one who stood at the edge of that circle, watching the turn of its wheel. A bird in flight could mark the path of destiny. A drifting cloud could carry a warning. The curl of smoke from a fire might whisper what tomorrow holds. Seers were not fortune tellers in the modern sense, peddling certainties for coin. They were observers, listeners, interpreters of symbols. They leaned into silence, letting the patterns of nature speak. To them, nothing was random. Every branch that broke, every shadow that flickered, every change in the wind carried meaning. And so they trained their eyes, their ears, and their inner stillness to notice. You imagine yourself seated near one of these figures, on the damp earth by a sacred oak. The fire before you burns low, flames licking at the night. Around you, leaves rustle, stirred by a quiet wind. The seer does not speak quickly. Their gaze rests upon the embers, the shapes that rise and vanish, each one a signal, each one a part of a larger design. Their whispers carry no fear, only calm, as though the unknown is not an enemy, but a teacher. Among the Celts, prophecy held weight. It was not idle curiosity. Before great battles, chieftains sought the words of the seers. Before long journeys, families listened for their counsel. Even the smallest ventures, planting a field or settling a dispute, could be colored by a vision. Yet these words did not bind. The future was not fixed. A prophecy revealed possibilities, like paths in a forest. One might follow, or one might turn aside. The seer showed the map. Choice still belonged to the one who listened. Birds were among the most trusted messengers. Their wings cut the sky in patterns that the trained eye could read. A raven circling above the trees might foretell death or change. A flock scattering suddenly could signal danger near. The eagle, soaring high and solitary, was often seen as a sign of strength or divine favor. Each flight was a sentence in a greater language, a script written across the open air. Other seers turned to fire. Flames offered a shifting canvas, alive with movement, revealing shapes that flickered in and out of sight. A curling smoke that drifted east might carry one meaning, while sparks leaping west might carry another. Fire was alive, unpredictable, yet it mirrored the pulse of fate itself. Watching it was to watch time dance in miniature. Leaves, too, were not without their voice. In the rustle of branches, in the way autumn leaves fell upon water, seers traced the hidden balance of things. Nature, for them, was a living text, endlessly writing, endlessly revealing. One can sense how their world was quieter, more open to listening. No metal machine, no rushing of traffic, no layers of noise. To wait in silence for a bird's wing beat, to sit in patience before a glowing fire. This was a way of life, not a performance. In their quiet, they invited the unseen to speak. Stories tell of seers whose visions reached far beyond their village. In the Welsh traditions, the figure of Taliesin emerges, poet, prophet, and bard. His words carried the weight of foresight, as though he had drunk from a well of endless knowledge. In Ireland, tales speak of women seers who stood at the edges of war, their cries foretelling bloodshed before the first weapon was raised. Prophecy was not bound to one form, nor one gender. It moved where it willed. The people feared yet also revered such figures. To speak the future was a heavy act. Words could wound, or they could protect. A blessing spoken at the right time could change a life. A warning ignored could lead to ruin. And so, the seer lived both within the community and apart from it, trusted, but never entirely touched. The Romans, encountering the Druids, wrote of their prophets with a mix of awe and suspicion. To them, the rituals seemed strange, the watching of animals and the reading of signs unsettling. Yet even Rome had its own augurs, men who studied the flight of birds, the patterns of entrails, the play of thunder and lightning. Though they judged, they also mirrored. The desire to know what lies ahead is not bound to one people. It is as human as the breath itself. You begin to notice how prophecy was less about control and more about surrender. To hear the words of a seer was to remember that life is not entirely your own. Forces move beyond sight. Events ripple from far away. The future is not always shaped by will, but also by tides greater than the self. Yet there was gentleness in this acceptance. A vision was not always grim. Prophecy could speak of abundance, of peace, of the birth of a child who would bring honor to a line. Just as storms can be read in clouds, so too can sunlight be seen in their breaking. Imagine again the fire, its glow painting the seer's face. Around you, shadows shift, the night deepens. You hear their whisper, not as command, but as reflection. The world is speaking, always, if one learns how to listen. To sit with them is to feel the veil between now and what may come thin and translucent. The moment stretches. Each sound carries weight. The crack of a branch is no longer random. The call of an owl carries meaning. The fire's sway holds a secret. And in this heightened quiet, you begin to sense, not the details of tomorrow, but the truth that tomorrow is alive, already breathing within the present. The seer does not insist you believe. They do not demand that you follow. They only invite you to notice, to soften, to remain open. For in openness, prophecy is not a chain but a reminder that the world is larger than the self, and that destiny whispers not in thunder, but in the gentlest shift of air. And so you sit, watching as the embers glow, as the night folds closer. The seer speaks no final word, no sharp conclusion, only a silence that feels like a door, not shut, not open, but waiting. The question lingers. If every rustle, every flame, every flight of a bird carries meaning, what, in this moment, is the world saying to you? Chapter 17. Conflict and Decline. The story of the Druids, once vibrant in ritual and rooted in the living earth, begins to shift when Rome expands its grasp across the Celtic world. The Druids had long been guardians of oral tradition, of sacred groves of lore and memory. But Rome, with its military legions and its rigid order, saw them not as wise keepers, but as obstacles. Julius Caesar, when he campaigns in Gaul, writes of them with both curiosity and unease. He notes their knowledge of the stars, their strict training, their power over life and death in society. To Rome, this influence is dangerous. A priesthood that inspires loyalty beyond the empire's reach cannot be tolerated. Suppression begins not with sudden violence, but with careful pressure. The closing of sacred spaces, the breaking of gatherings, the outlawing of sacrifice. Yet the Druids persist for a time. They move deeper into groves, into the quiet folds of land where oak and mist conceal them. Their knowledge survives in whispers taught from master to apprentice. Oral tradition, though fragile, still carries weight. But even whispers cannot escape the march of empire forever. On the island of Mona, now Anglesey in Wales, Rome directs its full attention to them. The Druids there had become a symbol of resistance, their presence woven into the spirit of rebellion. Tacitus describes the assault, Roman soldiers landing on the shores, facing not only warriors, but women with disheveled hair, raising torches, and Druids calling out curses from the water's edge. The scene unsettles even hardened soldiers. Still, Rome prevails. Temples are destroyed, groves are cut down, the sacred heart of Druidic practice wounded. It is here that decline takes on its deeper weight. Not an ending, but a slow unraveling. The Druids are never entirely erased, but their center weakens. Without gathering places, without safe ground for their councils, the cohesion of their order begins to fade. Oral tradition, which had once flowed across generations, becomes more fragile when lines of teachers are broken. Each silenced voice severs a link in memory's chain, and then comes Christianity. At first, only a quiet presence, carried by traders, by missionaries, by small communities. But soon it grows into a tide. Christianity, unlike Druidry, writes its story down. Its scriptures are portable, its authority bound to text and church rather than grove and memory. The strength of the Druids, their spoken word, their oral law, now becomes their vulnerability. In a world turning to the permanence of writing, their wisdom seems to vanish with each passing elder. Christian leaders, too, view the Druids as rivals. To them the groves are sites of pagan error, the sacrifices echoes of darkness. As churches rise, old stones are repurposed, and sacred wells are rededicated to saints. The symbols remain in the land, but their meaning is rewritten. Still, decline does not mean absence. The memory of the Druids lingers in folklore, in whispers of healers, in the traditions of bards who keep fragments alive through song and tale. Even Christian scribes, though hostile, cannot resist recording traces of the old ways. Monastic manuscripts in Ireland, written centuries later, preserve shadows of Druidic belief hidden within stories of gods and heroes. What survives is incomplete, yet it carries an echo. You imagine standing among the stones of a ruined circle, the air heavy with silence. There is no ceremony now, no priest chanting, no fire burning at its center. But the stones hold memory. They lean into the earth as if listening, bearing witness to lives that once turned their gaze to the sky, seeking guidance in stars and in flame. The decline of the Druids is not the end of their story, for the land itself remembers. Folklore carries fragments in gentler forms, the wise woman at the edge of the village, the healer who knows herbs by heart, the poet who sings of ancestors long gone. These figures echo the old order. They no longer call themselves Druids, yet they keep pieces of what the Druids guarded. The knowledge of plants, the cycles of the moon, the belief that the seen and unseen are interwoven. These linger quietly, resilient in the margins. Conflict shapes memory as much as it shapes history. Rome sought to silence the Druids, yet, in doing so, it ensured they would be remembered as resistors. Christianity sought to overwrite them, yet the persistence of folklore meant that old symbols remained, if only redefined. The story of decline becomes also a story of survival through transformation. In time, the word Druid itself becomes myth. Later generations imagine them as magicians, as seers cloaked in mystery. The real men and women who once mediated law and ritual fade into legend, but legends too keep memory alive. They move through time differently, less exact but enduring. As centuries pass, their presence is faint yet undeniable. In Irish law texts, echoes of their authority still remain, adapted under Christian eyes. In Welsh poetry, the bardic tradition speaks in tones that may once have belonged to Druidic chants. Even the landscape carries their trace. Place names tied to groves, hills, and stones that were once sacred sites. Decline, then, is not disappearance. It is a shifting of presence, from open authority to hidden memory, from public ritual to quiet survival. And perhaps this was always the nature of their wisdom, not to be held in one age alone, but to move like water, reshaping itself through each change, leaving marks that endure in unexpected places. You feel, as the story settles, that endings are never as absolute as they appear. Silence does not erase, and suppression does not wholly destroy. Somewhere in the earth, in the roots of old trees, in the rhythm of forgotten songs, the Druids still breathe. Not in the way they once did, but as a presence folded into memory itself. The chapter exhales there, not with closure, but with a lingering awareness that decline is only one form of survival. Chapter 18. The Christian lens. When the last voices of the Druids began to fade, memory itself found new vessels. The traditions once carried by spoken word, by ritual under oaken sky, began to take shape in ink, parchment, and the hands of monks. These scribes, working in dimly lit scriptoria across Ireland and Britain, wrote not simply to preserve, but to interpret. What had once lived in the air and the earth was now translated into the language of Christian thought. The monks were not neutral. Their task was framed by their faith, shaped by a vision of the world steeped in scripture and salvation. In their retellings, gods became kings, spirits became saints, and heroes were dressed in moral lessons suited to a new age. The transformation was subtle at times and abrupt at others. Yet beneath the Christian lens, fragments of older belief remained, buried but not erased. Consider the figure of Brigid. Once a goddess of fire, poetry, and fertility, She was revered by the Druids as a bringer of life and inspiration. Under Christian influence, Brigid did not vanish. She became Saint Brigid of Kildare, one of Ireland's most beloved holy women. The saint's miracles echoed the goddess's powers, healing, abundance, and the sacred flame that never went out. Here, the Christian story and the pagan memory intertwined, inseparable, flowing into one another like two rivers meeting. The scribes also touched the great cycles of myth. The tales of the Tuatha De Danann, the shining people said to dwell in the other world, were not discarded. Instead, they were softened into stories of fairy hosts, reduced in stature, yet still remembered. What was once divine became folkloric. What was once eternal became seasonal, tied to mists, hills, and twilight hours. Through Christian retelling, myth did not end. It changed costume, hiding in plain sight. The monks also reshaped battles into allegory. Epic struggles between light and darkness were no longer viewed as cosmic balances, but as lessons of virtue and sin. The Dagda, a powerful father figure among the gods, appeared in stories reinterpreted with Christian undertones, his great cauldron of plenty resembling themes of divine providence. Cuchulainn, the tragic hero of Ulster, was depicted in terms closer to martyrdom than to the endless cycles of heroic fate. Through these adjustments, myth became a teacher in Christian moral language, and yet the old rhythm still pulsed. You can feel it when you hear of feasts, of Samhain fires, of Beltane dawns. Though described in Christian manuscripts, these festivals carried echoes of their earlier meanings. The scribes wrote of them as cultural customs, sometimes even as superstitions, yet the rituals endured, keeping their bones intact beneath the new flesh of Christian interpretation. Some myths resisted the pen more stubbornly. The wildness of the Morrigan, the goddess of fate and battle, was difficult to mold. She appeared in texts as a shadowed, almost ominous figure, her independence reframed as something threatening. Yet her presence survived nonetheless, reminding readers that some forces could not be fully absorbed into Christian allegory. In this way, the memory of the Druids slipped into manuscripts not as itself, but as reflection. Like a stone seen through water, its shape is altered, but its essence remains. You imagine these monks at their desks, hearing whispers of the old stories from villagers, from aging poets, from fragments of songs. They recorded what they could, but in language that would align with their new faith. And in doing so, they became unlikely preservers, guardians of myths they no longer fully believed, yet could not let disappear. The Christian lens did more than change myths. It made them survivable. Without the monks, perhaps the tales would have faded entirely. Instead, they were reframed, and through reframing, they crossed into centuries where they could still be read, still be spoken, still be remembered. Memory, though transformed, continued its journey. Think of how stories move through time. They do not remain fixed. They adapt, bend, and disguise themselves. The oak staff becomes a cross. The goddess becomes a saint. The shining hosts become fairy folk who slip between worlds. Yet the spirit within them, the sense of a living, enchanted cosmos, remains. When you hear these myths now, you are hearing two voices at once. One belongs to the monks, careful, devout, reshaping. The other belongs to the ancient singers, their words echoing faintly through the centuries, never entirely silenced. Between them, a dialogue continues, soft but unbroken. And so the Druidic memory did not end when Christianity rose. It slipped into new garments, survived beneath new names, and lingered in whispers of folklore. Even today, When you read a medieval manuscript or listen to a story told by the hearth, you are meeting both the Christian scribe and the ancient poet. Their voices are braided together, inseparable, bound by time. The question lingers gently, unresolved. When a story changes its shape, is it still the same story, or has it become something new? Chapter 19. The medieval shadow of the Druids. By the Middle Ages, the Druids themselves were long vanished from the living memory of Europe. Their groves were empty. Their sacred fires had gone cold. Yet the silence they left behind did not vanish. Instead, it settled into the imagination of chroniclers, poets, and wandering storytellers. What remained of the Druids was not practice, but shadow, faint impressions passed on in rumor and retelling. Medieval chroniclers often describe the Druids less as men of ritual and more as figures of wonder. Some painted them as philosophers of the forest, keepers of wisdom too ancient for Christian lands. Others cast them as magicians, masters of hidden powers that clung to the stones and hills of the Celtic world. The truth was less accessible than ever. What filtered through their pens was less memory, more myth. In the writings of Geoffrey of Monmouth, the Druids appeared not as remembered teachers, but as pieces of a larger tapestry woven for kings and courts. Geoffrey's tales of Merlin, for instance, drew on echoes of Druidic archetypes, wise men tied to nature, healers, and prophets who moved between worlds. The figure of the Druid blurred into legend, a vessel for the longing of an age that sensed it had lost something it could not recover. Travelers, too, carried fragments. Pilgrims crossing the landscapes of Ireland and Britain sometimes spoke of old places marked by standing stones, of circles where no church yet stood. Their words suggested that even without names or stories, the land itself whispered of a vanished priesthood. Villages grew up beside these ancient stones, where the old and the new world touched but did not blend. In their telling, Druids were not fully gone. They lingered like a presence you feel but cannot see. Poets of the medieval period leaned into this faint inheritance. They wrote of Druids as seers, shrouded in robes who walked in silence before battles or offered cryptic counsel to kings. None of these images were faithful portraits, yet each revealed the shape of a shadow. They showed how medieval minds sought to anchor their understanding of power and mystery in figures older than Christianity, even as they dressed them in Christian frames. In Ireland, the bards carried something more direct. They had inherited oral traditions that spoke, in fragments, of Druids as judges and teachers. Their songs and poems did not preserve doctrine, but they held onto impressions of presence. A Druid might appear in a tale as an obstacle, a helper, or a wise voice that marked a turning point. These characters were not real Druids, but they kept alive the sense that once such people had existed. Even churchmen could not entirely avoid them. In sermons and moral tales, Druids were sometimes used as warnings, examples of the blindness of pagan wisdom compared to Christian truth. In these accounts, they were described as clever but misguided, their powers interpreted as deception rather than sacred. Yet, even in criticism, their names endured. To condemn was still to acknowledge. As centuries passed, the Druid became more symbol than history. In the imagination of the medieval world, they were both feared and admired, both remembered and forgotten. They lived in the half-light, never fully defined. For some, they were remnants of a dangerous past. For others, they were vessels of mystery, figures who gave texture to the landscape of time. The shadow of the Druids served a purpose in medieval thought. It gave depth to stories, weight to landscapes, and mystery to histories. By speaking of Druids, chroniclers, and poets, admitted that not everything could be contained within the Christian frame. Something older, stranger, and untamed lingered at the edges of memory. And so the Druids endured, not as themselves, but as a reflection carried in whispers across centuries. They lived in stone circles that stood against the wind. They moved through the lines of poems and the sermons of priests. They hovered on the threshold between fact and imagination, between the memory of a people and the myths of a later age. The medieval mind did not know the Druids as they were, yet it could not let them vanish entirely. Their shadow remained, soft, elusive, and unbroken. In the stillness of that shadow, you sense the persistence of memory, something that refuses to die even when its form has faded, something that drifts just beyond reach, waiting in the silence between stories. Chapter 20. Renaissance and Romantic Revival in. The long centuries after the Druids vanished from the living world, their name lingered as little more than a shadow. Yet memory does not always die when silence settles over it. In Europe, the late Middle Ages gave way to a new age of rediscovery. The Renaissance, with its hunger for classical learning and its fascination with lost antiquity, began to stir old words and older images back into motion. Among them, the figure of the Druid re-emerged, no longer as an actual priesthood, but as an idea, softened, reframed, and reshaped by imagination. Writers of the Renaissance had little access to the reality of Druid practice. Their knowledge rested on fragments preserved by Roman authors, on echoes carried in medieval manuscripts, and on whispers caught from folk tradition. Yet this lack of clarity proved fertile. What was vague became mysterious. What was incomplete became alluring. To a culture steeped in revival, the Druid was not a relic but a symbol, an emblem of something forgotten yet noble, ancient yet timeless. As Renaissance scholars studied old chronicles, they encountered names that seemed wrapped in secrecy. They saw the Druids as a priestly class from the misty isles, keepers of sacred rites and interpreters of nature's language. The lack of certainty allowed the imagination to wander. Some thought of them as philosophers equal to the sages of Greece. Others painted them as magicians bending the forces of the earth. The truth remained obscured, but the figure of the Druid began to stand tall once again, not in living groves, but in the minds of poets and historians. Centuries later, as the Romantic movement unfolded, the Druid would rise even higher. In this age, nature was no longer only a backdrop for human life. It was alive, filled with spirit, mystery, and meaning. Forests were not just timber, but sacred. Mountains were not only stone, but altars of grandeur. Rivers sang with memory. Within this world, the Druid was the natural guardian, the one who listened to the voice of the wind and understood the silence of the stars. The Romantic imagination leaned heavily on the image of the Druid as a poet of nature. Writers like William Blake, William Wordsworth, and later figures across Europe filled their verses with longing for lost wisdom, with the dream of a people who had once lived in harmony with earth and sky. These poets did not claim to know the Druids, in fact. Rather, they allowed the Druids to serve as symbols for something their own age deeply craved: a return to roots, to simplicity, to reverence before the natural world. You can almost picture how their words sounded in quiet rooms by candlelight. The reader would drift into landscapes painted with ancient groves, stones rising like guardians, and men in white robes lifting their arms to the sun. Whether or not such scenes had ever been real mattered less than the way they spoke to the soul. This revival of Druidic imagery carried with it a longing for origin. In a world rapidly industrializing where cities grew noisy and smoke blurred, the horizon poets and thinkers felt something slipping away. The Druids, though distant and dim, became figures who embodied what modern life lacked. They were imagined as men of silence, of vision, of ritual, guardians of balance. To think of them was to imagine a time before machines, before cities, before distance from the earth. Archaeology, still young in the Romantic Age, played its role as well. Stonehenge, Avebury, and other ancient monuments, though not proven to be Druidic, were quickly linked with them in popular thought. Travellers stood before those vast stones and imagined the robed figures of old walking among them, chanting prayers to the sun. Painters brought these visions to canvas, lonely monoliths beneath storm-lit skies, white-robed figures lifting branches in ceremony. The image was compelling. It was not history, it was longing painted into myth. The 18th and 19th centuries saw not only poetry, but also movements that attempted to restore or recreate Druidry as a living practice. Figures like William Stukeley, an English antiquarian, helped popularize the idea that Stonehenge and similar monuments were Druid temples. Though his conclusions were speculative, they spread widely. Stukeley himself often described the Druids as wise philosophers who preserved the pure religion of nature, unspoiled by later corruption. His writings became influential, shaping how generations after him imagined the Druids. Later, groups formed that called themselves Neo-Druids, blending romantic imagination with ritual. They held ceremonies at solstices and equinoxes, often at stone circles. They spoke of ancient wisdom, of harmony with the cosmos, of sacred bonds between human beings and the earth. Though these practices bore little resemblance to what the historical Druids may have done, they reflected something powerful, the ability of an ancient name to awaken new spiritual yearning. You might feel, as you hear this, how memory bends with time. The Druids who once stood among the oak groves were remembered not as they were, but as they were needed. In the Renaissance, they were seen as wise philosophers, heirs to Plato and Pythagoras. In the Romantic Age, they became prophets of nature, guardians of a world untamed. Each era looked back not to discover but to dream. The Druid became a mirror for human longing, for the scholar, a link to antiquity, for the poet, a muse of nature, for the seeker, a path back to forgotten roots. The truth, whatever it was, remained hidden. Yet perhaps that is what gave the Druids such lasting power. In the absence of fact, myth is free to live. Across Europe, the Romantic revival touched not only literature but also national identity. In Wales, Scotland and Ireland, the Druid became a symbol of cultural pride. Bards and nationalists spoke of their forebears as inheritors of Druid wisdom. Festivals revived bardic traditions. Poetry in the Welsh language blossomed with references to oak groves and sacred rites. The Druid, in this sense, was not only a figure of the past, but a seed for the future, strengthening roots that had nearly been forgotten. The Romantic revival also left its mark on art and music. Painters conjured landscapes where Druids stood, beneath eclipsed suns. Composers drew upon Celtic themes, weaving echoes of ancient ritual into symphonies and operas. The Druid, though unseen, shaped the creative spirit of an age, seeking both mystery and memory. You imagine how powerful it must have felt to stand at the threshold of modernity, yet to gaze backward toward a time wrapped in mist, to feel, in the stillness of a grove or the presence of an ancient stone, that something remained unbroken. That even as cities rose, the earth still held its hidden wisdom. And within that wisdom, the Druid remained. Even today, the image persists, Modern movements of neo-paganism and spiritual ecology draw inspiration from the romantic dream of the Druid. Though scholars now clarify that many of the old associations were guesses or inventions, the symbol continues to breathe. The Druid, in this sense, belongs not only to the past, but to the present, as a vessel for imagination and for yearning. The Renaissance gave the Druid back to memory. The Romantics gave the Druid back to longing. And through both, a figure once silenced by conquest became alive again, not in fact, but in spirit. The last words of this revival are not spoken loudly. They come as a quiet question that lingers even now. What is it in the human heart that seeks the Druid still? Perhaps it is the longing for wisdom older than words. Perhaps it is the wish to stand again beneath the trees, listening not to history, but to silence, and so the image remains, faint, fragile, yet enduring, as though somewhere, in dream, if not in fact, the Druids have never truly gone. Chapter 21. The 18th century Neo-Druids. In the 18th century, the stones of Britain stand as they always have. Silent, weathered, and enduring, they wait as people gather once again beneath their weight. The old religion is long gone, dissolved into centuries of memory and Christian dominance. Yet new voices rise, calling themselves Druids. They are not the same as those who once guided tribes in the shadow of oak groves, but they carry a longing, a hunger to reclaim a bond that time has severed. The Enlightenment fills the air with reason, yet alongside it blooms something more tender. In gardens, in quiet circles of thinkers, and on the edges of polite society, the imagination turns to the ancient world. The ruins of Stonehenge draw visitors like a shrine. Antiquarians sketch its broken lintels, debating how such stones were, raised what rituals once unfolded there, and who the shadowed figures of the past might have been. For the first time in many centuries, the word Druid is spoken not as a relic of legend, but as a living identity. The men who first take up this mantle are not priests in the old sense. They are poets, scholars, reformers, seekers of meaning. They dress in robes, white against the green of the countryside, and gather in circles to offer prayers to the sun or the seasons. Some recite fragments of ancient verse. Others invent entirely new rites, modeled on what they imagine ancient Druids might have done. In their gatherings, fact and invention intertwine, yet beneath it all rests the same pulse, a desire to stand. Closer to the mysteries of nature, you imagine one of these ceremonies. The wind stirs through grass as the group forms a ring. The sun rises higher, its light spilling across standing stones. A voice begins to chant, not in an ancient tongue, but in the language of the present, shaped to sound timeless. Others join, lifting their arms, holding branches of oak as symbols of strength and wisdom. The ceremony is both play and prayer, yet the faces reveal sincerity. Their longing is not for perfect accuracy, but for a sacred link, however fragile. The first major figure among these revivalists is John Aubrey, a 17th century antiquarian whose fascination with ancient monuments plants the seed. He surveys Stonehenge and Avebury, declaring them Druid temples. Though his ideas rest more on imagination than evidence, they shape the next century profoundly. Later, William Stukeley, another antiquarian and clergyman, carries this vision further. He walks the circles of Avebury, sketches every stone, and calls himself an arch-druid. To him, the Druids are not barbarians, but wise philosophers who preserved a pure form of natural religion. In his writings, Stukely weaves the Druids into a grand story of human spirituality. He suggests they practiced an ancient monotheism, worshipping the one creator through nature. This idea, though far from the truth of Iron Age ritual, comforts his Christian readers. It makes the Druids safe, figures of wisdom who can be admired without threatening the faith of the present. Through this lens, the Druids are reborn not as feared priests of blood sacrifice, but as gentle sages of harmony and truth. It is within this current that organized neo-Druid groups begin to appear. In 1717, in a London tavern, men gathered to form what they call the Ancient Order of Druids. The setting is modest: wooden tables, low candlelight, the quiet murmur of voices. Yet the decision they make echoes loudly. From this moment onward, there is a Druid order once again, however new its shape may be. The group blends social fellowship with ritual, part secret society, part spiritual circle. Members adopt titles of Archdruid, Bard, and Ovate, reaching backward into fragments of Celtic lore. Through the 18th century, such societies multiply. Some meet for solemn ceremonies among stone circles. Others evolve into fraternities resembling the Freemasons, using Druid imagery as symbols of moral growth, charity, and unity. At times, the focus is more on convivial gatherings than sacred ritual, yet the presence of the name Druid keeps alive the sense of an older current flowing beneath. Even when their ceremonies are inventions, the hunger that drives them is real, the human need to belong to an ancient story. The romantic imagination breathes heavily upon these circles. Poets and dreamers find in the Druids a mirror for their own visions. They see the groves, the wild landscapes, the solemn stones, and they picture priestly figures wrapped in mist, communing with the earth. This vision is more art than history, yet it reshapes how generations think of the word Druid. Even now, when you hear it, the image that comes to mind is likely closer to this romantic dream than to the scattered fragments of fact preserved. In Roman texts, consider the paradox. The neo-Druids of the 18th century stand on soil where ancient Druids once walked, yet they hold no unbroken chain of teaching. Their rituals are fabrications, their prayers often improvised, and still their gatherings carry weight. For in creating something new under an old name, they reveal a truth about memory, that the past is not only what has been, but also what we choose to honor. The ceremonies may not echo Iron Age rites, but they embody the longing to remain in dialogue with time itself. You sense this longing most clearly in their choice of setting. They do not gather in chapels or meeting halls alone. They seek the open sky, the circle of stones, the silence of groves. Even when the words are modern, the stage is ancient. This marriage of place and imagination allows them to feel that they are walking in old footsteps, bridging centuries with breath and voice. To stand among stones is to borrow the authority of the earth itself. And so a new chapter unfolds in the story of the Druids, neither entirely authentic nor entirely false. The neo-Druids of the 18th century remind us that history is not only preserved in records, but also reborn in the human will to remember. They remind us that the hunger for sacred belonging does not vanish even when tradition has been broken. It reappears in costumes, in chants, in gatherings, beneath the same sun that once looked down upon the true Druids. You begin to see that what matters most is not whether these rituals are exact copies of the past, but that they speak to the present. Each robe, each branch of oak, each circle formed by men calling themselves Druids is a gesture of reverence towards something larger than themselves. It is imperfect, yes, but in its imperfection lies its humanity, and as their voices fade into the air, you are left with the sense that the Druids never entirely die. They shift forms, pass through memory, and emerge again in new guises. Sometimes as scholars, sometimes as poets, sometimes as dreamers in taverns who long to raise the old names into light once more. The question that lingers is gentle but profound. Does the spirit of an ancient order depend on perfect continuity, or does it live wherever the longing for it takes root? That question drifts into silence, carried like smoke above the stones. Chapter 22. Sacred groves in modern paganism. Beneath branches that stretch like open hands, circles of people gather. They stand among trees, among stones, among quiet places, reclaimed from the noise of the world. These are the sacred groves of modern paganism, spaces where silence, ritual, and earth itself hold meaning. The ancient Druids left no written scriptures, no single map of what their groves had once been. What we know comes from fragments in Roman accounts, whispers in folklore, and the faint echo of memory passed down in ritual. Yet the longing for sacred trees, for sanctuaries beneath the open sky, survives. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Druidic orders, neo-pagan groups, and solitary seekers returned to these spaces, not as exact restorations of what was, but as living sanctuaries for spirit. A sacred grove is not only a cluster of trees, it is a threshold. The simple act of stepping into one feels different. Paths narrow, light softens, and sound bends. A bird call, a breeze through branches, the crackle of twigs beneath the foot. These become more than natural noise. They become part of the liturgy of place. In modern pagan traditions, the grove is where ritual aligns with earth, where human voices do not dominate but join the chorus already there. Some groves form around ancient stone circles like Avebury or Castlerig, where people once gathered for reasons only partly understood. Others rise in city parks or quiet woodlands, ordinary places transformed through intention. A line of oaks, a circle marked by standing staves, even the edge of a meadow can become a grove when entered with reverence. Modern Druid orders often speak of three kinds of sacred space: the grove, the circle, and the hearth. The grove is outward, a place where community meets the more than human world. Rituals there often honor the turning of the seasons, the solstices and equinoxes, the cross-quarter days of Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnasad. Fires are lit, poems spoken, and offerings given back to the land. Within these rituals, the tree stands as more than symbol. It becomes axis. Many modern pagans picture the world tree, its roots in the underworld, its branches in the heavens, its trunk in the realm of humans. Standing in a grove, one can imagine oneself as that tree, rooted, reaching, steady in the center of worlds. In some traditions, groves are formally consecrated. Members of an order will walk the boundary, call the four directions, invoke the elements, air, fire, water, earth, and open a circle of protection. Within this ring, ordinary ground becomes sacred ground. Yet for others, the grove needs no formal boundary. The trees themselves are guardians, the soil itself a consecrated altar. You can imagine yourself among such a gathering. A quiet group forms beneath oak and ash. Some carry drums, others bring nothing but their presence. A small fire burns in a cauldron, its smoke lifting into dusk. Voices rise not in chant alone, but in simple words of gratitude. The ritual is less about spectacle and more about listening, less about declaring truths, more about honoring mystery. Sacred groves in modern paganism are not bound by one interpretation. To some, they reconnect with Celtic myth, invoking deities like Brigid or Lugh. To others, They are ecological sanctuaries, reminders of Earth's fragility in an age of deforestation and climate change. In both cases, the grove becomes a space where reverence for nature is not abstract, but embodied. Archaeologists speak of ancient nemata, sacred clearings where Druids held ceremony. Modern pagans sometimes use this same word, nematon, to describe their ritual groves. It may be a place open to the sky or a shaded hollow. What matters is not its size or fame, but its sense of presence. In entering, people feel the world slow. A stillness opens, one that is not created but revealed. Across Britain, America, and beyond, groves take many forms. In Glastonbury, ceremonies are held on the slopes of the Tor, where hawthorn trees bloom with white blossoms that pilgrims once called holy. In California, redwood circles serve as temples, their trunks rising like living pillars. In Australia, eucalyptus groves have become ritual spaces for druidic orders, adapting to the Southern Hemisphere's seasons. Each place holds the same core, a bond between Earth and those who step upon it in reverence. Groves also become teaching grounds. In the order of bards, ovates, and druids, initiates learn not only ritual words but also ways of sensing nature. They are taught to pause in silence, to notice the movement of birds, to feel the change of wind direction. The grove is not only a stage for ceremony, it is a classroom where the natural world itself is the teacher. There is also the solitary grove. Not every practitioner joins a large circle. Many choose a hidden place in the woods, a single tree by a riverbank, or even a small garden corner. There, rituals are spoken quietly, sometimes wordless, sometimes accompanied only by breath. These private groves, though unseen by others, carry the same weight. For what makes a grove sacred is not its fame, but the depth of attention brought into it. In modern times, sacred groves also serve as acts of restoration. Where forests have been cut, pagans plant new trees, dedicating them as living temples. Community projects arise where once empty land becomes rewooded. The grove, both a ritual site and a gesture toward future generations. The sacred here is not only spiritual, it is ecological, rooted in the healing of Earth itself. To step into such a grove is to cross into a different kind of time. Modern schedules loosen their grip. The pulse of the land takes precedence. You feel how ritual unfolds not in haste, but in rhythm. The lighting of a candle, the pouring of an offering, the waiting in silence. Even those who do not share the beliefs can sense the shift. Something in the grove feels set apart, quietly potent. And when the ritual ends, the grove remains. People leave offerings of flowers, bread, or water. They depart slowly, often in silence, aware that they are guests who must walk gently. The trees keep their stillness. The earth receives what is given, and the memory of the moment lingers like a breath not yet released. Modern sacred groves remind us that sanctity does not belong only to stone temples or ancient texts. It can be found beneath branches, within circles of friends, and in the silent company of trees. These groves may not replicate the ancient past exactly, but they hold something equally real, the human need to honor, to listen, and to belong. Perhaps this is why the image of the grove endures. It speaks of shelter, of rootedness, of the quiet companionship of living beings older than ourselves. And in that companionship you might sense not only connection to tradition, but a soft echo of your own stillness. When you imagine standing beneath the branches, hearing the leaves move as if in prayer, you begin to feel how little separates the ancient from the modern. The grove is alive again, not as it was, not as it will ever perfectly be, but as it is now. A sanctuary where spirit and earth breathe together. And so in these sacred groves of modern paganism, the question lingers. When you next step among trees, what might you hear if you listen not only with your ears, but with your whole presence? Chapter 23. The archaeology of silence. Silence surrounds the ancient Druids more than words ever could. The stones they raised, the earth they pressed their feet upon, the trees they circled in reverence, these remain. Yet their voices, their songs, their teachings mostly dissolve into mystery. Unlike the Greeks or the Romans, the Druids left little written record. Their wisdom passed from mouth to ear, preserved in memory and ritual rather than parchment or clay. And when memory fades, what lingers is silence. Archaeologists step carefully into this silence. They do not fill it with assumption, but sift through what the ground releases. A buried altar, blackened by fire, suggests ritual. A carved figure, worn smooth by centuries, suggests worship. Animal bones, arranged with unusual care, hint at offerings once made to unseen gods. These are fragments like scattered syllables of a language we can no longer fully speak. The Romans wrote of the Druids, but their accounts were not neutral. They painted images of sacrifice and superstition, partly as a way to justify conquest. Archaeologists know to weigh these reports against what the soil itself reveals, and often the earth tells a gentler story of feasts shared, of gatherings around sacred fires, of reverence for rivers and groves. Silence in this way protects what words distort. When you stand before a Celtic stone circle today, you are surrounded by absence as much as present. The stones rise, but the chants that once echoed between them are gone. The spaces between the stones are as meaningful as the stones themselves. It is a kind of architecture of silence, an emptiness that asks you to listen inward. Some fragments whisper louder than others. In certain bogs of Ireland, archaeologists find offerings preserved by peat, cauldrons filled with butter, ornaments of gold, weapons laid down carefully rather than lost. To bury such objects was to remove them from human use, surrendering them into sacred silence. They remain there for centuries, untouched, as if the earth itself were a vault of devotion. Human remains, too, are sometimes uncovered in this quiet archive. Bodies laid with grave goods or bound in ways that suggest ritual. These discoveries stir debate. Sacrifice, punishment, or devotion? The silence resists definitive answers. And perhaps it is meant to, for in the space between certainty and wonder, reverence grows. Archaeology measures, catalogues, dates, and analyzes. But silence cannot be measured. The stillness of a grove at dawn, the hush of a ritual where words were forbidden, the weight of meaning carried by gesture rather than speech. These do not fossilize, they pass into the unseen. Yet silence itself leaves an impression, just as the body leaves a hollow in the earth long after the bones have crumbled. You may imagine stepping into one of these excavated sites. The trench cuts through layers of time. A shard of pottery gleams in the soil. Charcoal reveals a fire that once warmed hands, now long dissolved. The archaeologist kneels, brushes, records. But around this careful work is a wider quiet. The absence of the laughter, the prayers, the cries, the instructions once spoken here. The site feels both alive and empty, both known and unknowable. Silence in Druidic culture was not only absence, it was discipline. Ancient sources describe how Druids trained for decades, holding vast teachings in memory. Silence was part of that training, a way of shaping the mind to hold truth without rushing to utter it. What we cannot read in their handwriting, we can sense in the way they guarded wisdom with pauses, with restraint, with deliberate stillness. Archaeologists too must learn this restraint. They resist the urge to declare certainty where only fragments remain. A circle of post holes may be the remains of a temple or of a dwelling. A pit filled with bones may speak of sacrifice or of a communal meal. In the silence between possibilities, humility becomes necessary. The silence itself demands it. Across Europe, there are hundreds of sites tied to Druidic practice. Hill forts, enclosures, burial mounds, sacred wells. Each one tells a sliver of the story, none tells it whole. This patchwork of evidence mirrors the patchwork of memory we carry in ourselves. Some experiences we can explain clearly, others live only as feelings, wordless and enduring. The archaeology of silence is not only about the past, it reflects the present as well. For silence is not extinct. It waits in the stillness between words, in the pause after a question, in the breath held before a reply. The ancient Druids are distant, yet the silence they left behind is immediate. You feel it in the hush of a forest, in the vastness of night, in the unmarked spaces of your own memory. Think of the offerings buried in bogs. They are no longer possessions but presences. The gold is not jewelry but devotion. The butter is not food but prayer. When you leave something unspoken or when you let a thought dissolve without turning it into speech, you are doing something similar. You are placing it in the peat of your own silence, surrendering it to something beyond use. The absence of writing means that every recovered fragment is precious. A carved stone, even without inscription, speaks. The very choice to carve reveals. A mind reaching toward permanence. Yet what the carving meant remains locked in quiet. Archaeology touches it gently, but does not break that lock. The meaning belongs as much to silence as to stone. In this way, the archaeology of silence honors the unseen as much as the seen. It treats the gaps not as failures but as thresholds. The Druids may have chosen not to write, believing that spoken words carried in memory carried more life than marks on parchment. Their silence was deliberate, protective, and though that silence frustrates the historian, it deepens the sacredness of what remains. You begin to feel how silence itself can be a kind of inheritance. The ancient Druids pass it forward not as text, but as atmosphere. They teach less by words than by what cannot be spoken. And the archaeologist, bending over the soil, records not only the artifacts but also the spaces between them, the negative space that tells its own quiet story. To honor silence is to recognize that not everything must be revealed, not everything must be said. Some truths live best when unspoken. Some presences grow stronger in the dark. The archaeology of silence does not try to banish mystery. It learns to dwell beside it, respectfully, patiently, reverently. The chapter itself becomes a pause, an echo of that tradition. Just as the stones rise in a circle around emptiness, so the words here encircle what they cannot name. And in that encircling, something stirs. Not a conclusion, but a presence. Silence remains. Chapter 24. Nature as the eternal temple. In the old Druidic path, there are no walls that define a sanctuary, no roofs that separate the faithful from the open sky. The temple is already here, spread across every grove, woven into the bend of rivers, and carried on the breath of the wind. To understand the Druids, one must first set aside the idea of religion housed within stone structures. Their altar is the earth itself, and every element of the living world becomes scripture. to be read not in words, but in silence. The grove holds a special place in this vision. Tall oaks rise like ancient pillars, their crowns intertwined, forming ceilings of green where the light filters softly. Beneath them, the air feels charged, not with grandeur, but with presence. For the Druids, these trees are more than symbols. They are living beings, guardians of wisdom. An oak is not only wood and leaf, it is lineage, continuity, and the breath of generations. Rivers too carry their sacred weight. They move ceaselessly, tracing paths through stone and soil, whispering lessons of flow and surrender. In their currents, the Druids see renewal, the unending cycle where life is carried forward and returned again. To stand by a river's edge is to listen to a scripture in motion, one that never speaks the same way twice, yet always carries the same truth. The stones scattered across the land are also teachers. Some are marked with carvings, others are left untouched, but their weight alone commands reverence. A stone is time solidified, the memory of the earth held in silence. Where some see coldness, the Druids see permanence, a reminder that human life is but a moment compared to the patience of rock. And above it all, the sky stretches wide. The shifting clouds, the stars moving in their fixed yet mysterious courses, the waxing and waning moon, all form part of the eternal temple. The sky is never empty. It is alive with pattern, rhythm, and light. To lift the eyes is to be reminded that one walks not under chance, but under a vast, unfolding design. For the Druids, none of this requires doctrine. Reverence is not bound to a creed, but grows naturally out of observation and presence. The act of stepping into the forest, of sitting by water, of touching stone, of watching the night sky, these are prayers in their simplest form. They do not divide the sacred from the ordinary, for every moment, every place carries the weight of sanctity. You begin to sense how this differs from the modern need for separation between ritual and daily life. In the Druidic way, one does not enter the temple, one is already within it. Every breath is shared with the trees, every drink of water is communion, every sunrise a hymn. The rhythm of existence itself is the liturgy. Such reverence shapes not only belief, but action. When the natural world is understood as sacred text, its preservation becomes inevitable. To harm the grove would be to desecrate a sanctuary. To pollute the river would be to distort a scripture. The Druids carry an ethic born not of abstract rule, but of living reverence. To them, every act toward the earth is an act toward the divine. Archaeological traces of this worldview remain subtle. Stone circles rise in the landscape, not built as dwellings but as places aligned with the heavens. They are not fortresses but thresholds, linking earth to sky, human to cosmos. Within these circles, the alignment of sun and moon marks time, not just for survival but for ritual awareness. The land itself is calendar and compass, guiding not only the body but the spirit. In sacred groves, archaeologists find offerings, bones of animals, fragments of tools, even the remains of people. These offerings are not casual, they are given as one gives to a living presence. A tree may stand silently, yet it receives with the dignity of a deity. A river accepts what is surrendered, carrying it into mystery. In each act of offering, the Druids affirm their place within a larger breathing whole. You might imagine sitting in such a grove, the air cool, the ground soft, the scent of moss rising. Around you, the trunks form quiet columns, their surfaces rough with age. A bird calls in the distance, its sound echoing between branches. Nothing here demands explanation. The silence itself is enough. And as you sit, you realize you are not outside of this temple, you are part of it. The eternal temple is not fixed to one location. It shifts with the turning of the seasons. In spring, blossoms are the scripture, delicate and new. In summer, the warmth of the sun becomes the hymn, steady and full. In autumn, the falling leaves are verses of impermanence, whispered as they return to soil. In winter, silence deepens and the bare branches speak of endurance. The temple is never closed, it changes form but never ceases. This way of seeing reshapes time itself. For the Druids, time is not linear but cyclical, like the river's return, like the sun's rising and setting, like the moon's waxing and waning. Each cycle is not repetition but renewal. Each season a reminder that death is not an end, but part of the temple's rhythm. In this sense, the eternal temple is not just nature around them, but the passage of time within them. Stone circles, sacred groves, rivers and skies, all of these are parts of one vast temple, yet none are separate from daily life. A meal shared beneath the open sky is a ritual. A walk across the field is a pilgrimage. A moment of silence by the river is a prayer. There is no division, only recognition. In modern times, when temples are often built in separation from the world, the Druidic vision offers a quiet reminder: the eternal temple is still here. The grove still stands, the rivers still flow, the stones still wait, and the sky still spreads above. What is needed is not to build, but to notice. You may find yourself even now catching glimpses of this temple, in the quiet between sounds, in the weight of a stone held in the hand, in the slow passing of clouds overhead. These moments are not lesser than grand rituals. They are the very heart of reverence. The Druids knew that silence is not emptiness, but present. That the grove does not need words to teach. That the river speaks without voice. That the sky guides without command. And in their quiet way they show us that the eternal temple has never closed its doors. It is always open, always waiting, always alive. And as you imagine this vast temple of earth and sky, you begin to wonder if every breath, every step, every glance upward is already part of worship. Then perhaps the greatest act of reverence is not to seek, but simply to see.